What if I told you that the simple statement, "this sentence is false," could unravel the fabric of logic itself? You might think that's just a silly word game, but this paradox, known as the liar's paradox, has puzzled philosophers and logicians for centuries, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. Tonight, we're going to take you on a journey through a web of interconnected paradoxes, each one more mind-bending than the last. By the time we're done, you'll question everything you thought you knew about truth, reality, and the limits of human reasoning. Are you ready to have your mind blown while you drift off to sleep? All right, let's dive into the fascinating world of the liar's paradox. This deceptively simple statement has been messing with people's minds for centuries, and it's not hard to see why. We start with a seemingly innocent sentence. This statement is false. At first glance, it doesn't look like much, but when we try to figure out if it's true or false, things get really weird really fast. Here's the thing. If we say the statement is true, then it must be false because that's what it's claiming. But if we say it's false, then it must be true because that's what it's saying about itself. It's like a logical Ouroboros, constantly eating its own tail and never reaching a satisfying conclusion. This endless loop of contradiction is what makes the liar's paradox so mind-bending and frustrating for logicians and philosophers alike. The liar's paradox isn't some newfangled brain teaser cooked up by bored internet trolls. This bad boy has been around since ancient times. In fact, we can trace it back to the Greek philosopher Epimenides, who was from Crete. He famously said, "All Cretans are liars." Now, if you think about it, this statement is pretty similar to our modern version. If Epimenides is telling the truth, then he must be lying because he's a Cretan. But if he's lying, then his statement must be true. It's the same circular logic that makes our heads spin. Throughout history, some of the brightest minds have been scratching their heads over this paradox. It's not just a word game or a fun party trick, it actually challenges our fundamental understanding of truth, language, and logic. These are pretty big concepts that we usually take for granted in our day-to-day lives. But the liar's paradox comes along and throws a wrench in the whole system. Now, you might be thinking, surely someone must have figured out a solution by now, right? Well, it's not that simple. Some clever folks have tried to resolve the paradox by saying that the statement is neither true nor false, or that it's just meaningless gibberish. But here's the kicker. These solutions often lead to even more problems. It's like trying to plug a leak in a dam with your finger, only to have water start gushing out from a dozen other places. The liar's paradox isn't just a lone wolf in the world of logic. It's actually part of a whole family of self-referential paradoxes. These are statements or concepts that refer to themselves in a way that creates a contradiction. It's like the paradox has cousins, aunts, and uncles, all equally confusing and mind-bending. This family of paradoxes shows us that self-reference can be a tricky thing, especially when it comes to logic and language. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but does it really matter in the real world? Well, believe it or not, the liar's paradox isn't just some abstract philosophical curiosity. It has real implications for fields like mathematics, computer science, and even our understanding of human reasoning. In computer science, for example, programmers have to be really careful with self-referential constructs like recursive functions. If they're not managed properly, they can lead to paradoxical outcomes that can crash systems or create infinite loops. It's like the computer version of getting stuck in the "this statement is a false" loop. The paradox has also influenced the development of more robust logical systems. One example is type theory, which was introduced by the philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell. This theory organizes sets into different levels to prevent self-reference and avoid paradoxes. It's like creating a set of rules to make sure we don't accidentally stumble into logical quicksand. When we look at the liar's paradox, we're not just playing with words or trying to be clever. We're actually questioning some of the most fundamental assumptions we make about how logic and language work. It shows us that our usual ways of thinking about truth and falsehood might not always work as well as we think they do. It's a simple statement that opens up a whole world of logical complexity. But here's the really mind-blowing part. The liar's paradox is just the tip of the iceberg. It's connected to even more brain-twisting puzzles that challenge our understanding of reality itself. As we dig deeper into these paradoxes, we start to realize that the very concepts of truth, logic, and meaning might be more complicated than we ever imagined. If you thought the liar's paradox was mind-bending, get ready for something even more astonishing. We're about to explore a set of ideas that shook the very foundations of mathematics and logic. In 1931, a young mathematician named Kurt Gödel published his incompleteness theorems, and they changed everything we thought we knew about the certainty of mathematics. Now, in the early 20th century, mathematicians were on a mission. They wanted to create a complete and consistent system of mathematics. The idea was to have a set of rules and axioms that could prove everything that was true within that system. It seemed like a logical goal, right? After all, math is all about certainty and proof. But Gödel was about to turn this dream upside down. Gödel's first incompleteness theorem is a real head-scratcher. It states that in any consistent formal system that can express basic arithmetic, there will always be statements that are true, but can't be proven within that system. Let that sink in for a moment. No matter how comprehensive our mathematical system is, there will always be truths that lie beyond its reach. It's like trying to catch a shadow. The more you reach for it, the more it eludes you. This revelation sent shockwaves through the mathematical community. Imagine dedicating your life to building the perfect system of mathematics, only to find out that it's impossible. It's like trying to build a library that contains every book ever written, including a book about the library itself. There's always going to be something missing. But Gödel wasn't done yet. His second theorem took things even further. It states that such a system cannot prove its own consistency. In other words, we can never be absolutely certain that our mathematical foundations don't contain contradictions. It's like trying to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. It just doesn't work. These theorems are closely related to the liar's paradox we talked about earlier. Gödel essentially created a mathematical version of this statement is unprovable within formal systems. He showed that in any sufficiently complex mathematical system, you can construct a statement that says, this statement cannot be proven. If the statement is true, then it can't be proven, which means the system is incomplete. If it's false, then the system is inconsistent because it can prove a false statement. Either way, the system falls short of the ideal of completeness and consistency. The implications of Gödel's work extend far beyond the realm of pure mathematics. They touch on questions of artificial intelligence, the nature of human understanding, and the limits of knowledge itself. For example, in computer science and AI, Gödel's theorems suggest that there might be fundamental limitations to what algorithms can accomplish. No matter how advanced our AI systems become, there will always be problems they can't solve or truths they can't prove. In philosophy, Gödel's work raises profound questions about the nature of truth and knowledge. If even mathematics, the most rigorous and logical of human endeavors, has inherent limitations, what does that say about our ability to understand the universe? It suggests that there might be truths about reality that we can never prove or fully comprehend. The impact of Gödel's theorems on the mathematical climate of the early 20th century was enormous. Before Gödel, many mathematicians believed in the program of formalism, which aimed to reduce all of mathematics to a set of formal rules and axioms. Gödel's work showed that this program was fundamentally flawed. It revealed that mathematics is not a closed system but an open-ended endeavor, always with new truths to discover and new challenges to overcome. Gödel's theorems also have implications for the philosophy of mathematics. They challenge the Platonist view that mathematical truths exist independently of human minds and can be discovered through pure reason. If there are true statements that can't be proven, how can we be sure we're accessing some objective realm of mathematical truth? In a way, Gödel's incompleteness theorems are both humbling and exciting. They're humbling because they show us the limits of human knowledge and reasoning. No matter how smart we are or how advanced our mathematics becomes, there will always be truths beyond our grasp. But they're also exciting because they suggest that mathematics, and by extension human knowledge, is not a finished product, but an ongoing adventure. There will always be new things to discover, new problems to solve, and new paradoxes to ponder. Just when mathematicians thought they had a handle on sets, along came a question that would turn their world upside down. Can a set contain itself? This seemingly innocent query led to one of the most perplexing paradoxes in mathematics. And it all started with a guy named Russell, who couldn't leave well enough alone. We're talking about Russell's paradox, a mind-bending contradiction that shook the very foundations of mathematics in the early 20th century. So picture this, it's the dawn of the 1900s, and mathematicians are feeling pretty good about themselves. They've been working on set theory, which is basically just a fancy way of studying collections of objects. They think they've got it all figured out. But then along comes Bertrand Russell, and he's got a question that's about to ruin everyone's day. What about the set of all sets that don't contain themselves? Now, at first glance, this might not seem like such a big deal. But let's think about it for a second. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then by definition, it shouldn't. But if it doesn't, then it should. It's like a mathematical version of a dog chasing its own tail, except this dog is also questioning its own existence. This paradox didn't just give mathematicians a headache. It shook the very foundations of their field. It showed that naive set theory, which many mathematicians had been relying on, could lead to some serious contradictions. It's like they'd been building this beautiful mathematical house, and Russell came along and pointed out that the foundation was made of jelly. Now, if you're thinking this sounds a bit familiar, you're not wrong. Russell's paradox is similar to the liar's paradox in that it's self-referential. It's a set that's defined in terms of itself, just like a statement that refers to its own truth or falsehood. It's like the mathematical equivalent of looking into a mirror and seeing another mirror, and another, and another, until your brain starts to hurt. To resolve this paradox, mathematicians had to go back to the drawing board. They had to develop new, more rigorous systems of set theory. These systems put restrictions on what kinds of sets can be formed. It's like they had to create a new set of rules for their mathematical playground, because someone found a loophole in the old ones. But even with these new systems, the ghost of Russell's paradox still haunts mathematics. It reminds us that our intuitions about simple concepts like sets can lead us astray. We might think we understand something as basic as a collection of objects, but when we start asking tricky questions, things can get weird fast. Russell's paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of self-referential definitions. It's like trying to define a word using the word itself. It might seem like it makes sense at first, but if you think about it too hard, your brain starts to tie itself in knots. This paradox underscores the complexity involved in defining sets or rules that include or exclude themselves, revealing inherent problems in self-referential systems. But here's the thing. Russell's paradox isn't just some abstract mathematical curiosity. It has real implications for how we think about logic and reasoning. It shows us that even in the world of abstract mathematics, where everything is supposed to be neat and tidy, self-reference can lead to mind-bending contradictions. And as we go deeper into our exploration of paradoxes, we'll see how this theme of self-reference keeps popping up in unexpected places. It's like a mathematical version of "Where's Waldo?" Once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. The paradox also highlights the importance of careful definitions and constraints in formal systems. It's like building a house. If you don't have a solid foundation and clear blueprints, you might end up with a door that opens into thin air or a staircase that leads nowhere. In the same way, mathematical systems need clear rules and boundaries to avoid logical inconsistencies. But here's where it gets really interesting. Russell's paradox doesn't just apply to abstract mathematical concepts. It has implications for how we think about categories and classifications in the real world. Think about it. How often do we create categories that might include themselves? It's like trying to organize your closet and realizing you need a box labeled boxes. Where does that box go? This paradox also touches on some deep philosophical questions. It makes us question the nature of sets and collections, and by extension, the nature of categories and classifications in general. It's like it's asking us, can a category ever truly contain itself? And if it can't, what does that mean for how we organize and understand the world around us? In a way, Russell's paradox is both humbling and exciting. It's humbling because it shows us that even in mathematics, a field we often think of as absolute and certain, there can be surprising twists and turns. It reminds us that our understanding is always incomplete, that there's always more to discover. But it's also exciting because it opens up new avenues of thought. It challenges us to think more deeply about the concepts we take for granted. It's like a puzzle that, even when solved, leaves us with new questions to ponder. Now let's trim away the complexities and focus on a paradox that's a cut above the rest. What happens when a town's only barber is bound by a rule that creates an impossible situation? The barber paradox will have you questioning the very logic of everyday scenarios and maybe even your next haircut. Imagine a small town with just one barber. This barber has a unique rule. He shaves all and only those men who don't shave themselves. Sounds simple enough, right? But here's where things get hairy. Who shaves the barber? If he shaves himself, then, according to his own rule, he can't shave himself. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he must shave himself. It's enough to make your head spin faster than a barber's chair. This mind-bending scenario is known as the barber paradox, and it was actually introduced by our old friend Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century. Russell, always the clever one, created this paradox as a more accessible version of his famous paradox about sets. It's like he took the complex world of mathematical sets and brought it down to the street level of a barbershop. The barber paradox is another example of how self-reference can lead to logical contradictions. The barber's rule refers to itself, creating a situation that's impossible to resolve. It's like trying to cut your own hair while looking in a mirror. You keep chasing your reflection, but never quite catch up. Now, some people try to wiggle out of this paradox by saying things like, "Oh, the barber must be a woman," or "Such a barber can't exist." But these solutions are like trying to fix a bad haircut by shaving your head. They miss the point entirely. The paradox isn't about finding a practical solution. It's about showing how our everyday language and logic can lead us into impossible situations. This paradox is closely related to Russell's paradox that we talked about earlier. In fact, you could say they're like twins separated at birth. The barber is like the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, and the act of shaving is like set membership. It's the same logical structure, just dressed up in a different outfit. The barber paradox shows us how easily we can describe a situation that seems totally reasonable at first, but turns out to be logically impossible. It's like when you try to explain the plot of a time travel movie. It all makes sense until you start really thinking about it, and then your brain starts to hurt. This paradox also highlights the challenges of creating rules or systems that apply to themselves. This is a problem that pops up all over the place. In law, computer programming, and even in how we define words. It's like trying to write a dictionary where every word is defined using only the words that come after it in alphabetical order. Good luck with that. In the world of computer science, the barber paradox is like a warning sign for programmers. It reminds them to be careful when designing algorithms that have to handle recursive definitions and queries. If they're not careful, they might end up with a program that gets stuck in an endless loop, like a virtual barber, endlessly trying to decide whether to shave himself or not. Philosophically, the barber paradox makes us think more deeply about the nature of truth and self-reference. It shows us how self-referential statements can lead to logical inconsistencies. It's like looking into a funhouse mirror. The reflection you see might not match reality, but it still tells you something about how mirrors work. One approach to resolving paradoxes like this is through something called type theory. This is a way of categorizing sets into different types to prevent self-reference. In this system, a set can't contain itself or other sets of the same or higher type. It's like having different levels in a building where you're not allowed to go back down to a lower floor. This helps avoid the paradox, but it also shows how tricky it can be to create consistent rules when dealing with self-reference. The implications of the barber paradox go beyond just giving logicians and philosophers something to argue about over coffee. It raises questions about the nature of definitions and the limits of formal reasoning. It challenges our ability to create consistent rules that can apply in all situations. It's like trying to create a perfect set of rules for a game, only to realize that there's always some weird situation you didn't account for. From impossible haircuts to impossible ships, we're diving deeper into the murky waters of identity. What if I told you that you're not the same person you were as a child? Literally. The ship of Theseus paradox will make you question not just objects, but your very self. This ancient puzzle has been rocking the boat of philosophy for over 2 millennia, and it might just change how you think about your own identity. The story behind this paradox is pretty fascinating. It all starts with the legendary Greek hero Theseus, who was basically the ancient equivalent of a celebrity. The Athenians were so proud of this guy that they decided to keep his ship as a museum piece in the harbor. But here's where things get tricky. As time went on, the old wooden parts of the ship started to rot away. So the Athenians did what any of us would do with a prized possession. They replaced the rotting bits with new ones. Now, this is where our brains start to hurt a little. Over time, every single part of the ship was replaced. Every plank, every nail, every little bit of rigging, all of it was swapped out for new materials. So here's the million drachma question. Is it still the same ship? If not, at what point did it stop being the original ship of Theseus? Was it when they replaced the first plank? The 100th? Or maybe it was only when the very last original piece was swapped out. But wait, it gets even weirder. Imagine if someone went around collecting all those original planks and pieces as they were removed. And then, because they clearly had way too much time on their hands, they decided to rebuild the ship using all those original parts. Now we've got two ships, the one in the harbor that's been gradually replaced, and this Frankenship made of all the original bits. So which one is the real ship of Theseus? Is it both of them? Neither of them? This is the kind of question that could keep you up at night, which is perfect for our sleep-inducing paradox marathon. This paradox isn't just about ancient Greek boats, though. It touches on some really deep questions about identity and change that apply to pretty much everything in our world. Think about your favorite childhood toy. Maybe you've replaced the batteries a few times, or sewn up a torn seam. Is it still the same toy? What about your smartphone? If you've replaced the screen and the battery, is it the same phone? But here's where it gets really mind-bending. Think about your own body. It turns out that almost every cell in your body is replaced over the course of your life. The cells that make up your skin, your bones, even your brain are constantly being renewed. So, in a very real sense, you're not made of the same stuff you were as a kid. Are you still the same person? If not, at what point did you stop being you? This is where the ship of Theseus paradox starts to feel different from the other brain twisters we've looked at so far. It's not about logical contradictions or statements that can't be true or false. Instead, it's poking at something even more fundamental: the fuzzy nature of identity itself. We tend to think of objects and people as having a clear, unchanging identity. But when we look closer, that idea starts to fall apart. Philosophers have been scratching their heads over this one for centuries, and they've come up with all sorts of potential solutions. Some say that identity is all about continuity of form. As long as the ship, or person, or whatever, keeps the same shape and structure, it's the same thing. Others argue that it's about function. If it still does the job of being a ship, it's the same ship. And then there are those who say it's all about history. The ship in the harbor is the real one, because it has the unbroken historical connection to Theseus. But none of these solutions are entirely satisfying. They all have their own problems and edge cases. And that's kind of the point. The ship of Theseus paradox reveals that our common-sense notions of identity and sameness might not be as solid as we think they are. It's not just a fun thought experiment. It has real implications for how we think about the world and ourselves. In modern times, this paradox has found new life in discussions about technology and biology. Think about a computer that's had all its parts replaced over time. Is it still the same machine? In biology, it raises questions about personal identity and the nature of life itself. If we could replace all the parts of a living organism, would it still be the same individual? The ship of Theseus paradox even touches on legal and ethical questions. If a company gradually replaces all its employees in leadership, is it still responsible for actions taken by the previous iteration of the company? If a person's brain was gradually replaced with artificial neurons, at what point would they cease to be themselves? We've seen how paradoxes can challenge our understanding of identity and change, but now we're going to explore a paradox that questions the very nature of categories and definitions. Imagine you're standing on a beach and someone asks you to build a heap of sand. Easy enough, right? But here's the twist. They want you to tell them exactly when your pile of sand becomes a heap. This seemingly simple task is at the heart of the Sorites paradox, and it's about to make you question everything you thought you knew about measurement and classification. The word Sorites comes from the Greek word for heap, and this paradox is all about trying to figure out when a collection of things becomes a heap. It goes like this. 1 grain of sand is definitely not a heap. If you add 1 more grain, you still don't have a heap. But if you keep adding grains one by one, at some point you'll have a heap. The question is, at exactly what point does it become a heap? This is where things get tricky. You might be thinking, well, that's just sand. Who cares? But the Sorites paradox isn't just about sand heaps. It applies to all sorts of concepts we use every day. When does a person become old? How many hairs can you lose before you're considered bald? At what point does a joke become offensive? There's no clear boundary for any of these things, and that's what makes this paradox so mind-bending. The Sorites paradox challenges our understanding of categories and definitions in a fundamental way. It shows that many of our everyday concepts have fuzzy boundaries. We tend to think of things in clear-cut categories. Something either is a heap or it isn't. Someone is either old or they're not. But reality is often much more complex and nuanced than that. Some philosophers have tried to solve this paradox by introducing the idea of degrees of truth. Maybe something can be somewhat a heap, or mostly bald. This approach, known as fuzzy logic, rejects the idea that statements can only be true or false. Instead, it allows for partial truths, which might be closer to how we actually think about these concepts in real life. Other philosophers have taken a different approach. They argue that there is actually a precise boundary between a heap and a non-heap, or between baldness and non-baldness. We just can't know where it is. This view, called epistemicism, suggests that our inability to pinpoint the exact moment when something becomes a heap is a limitation of our knowledge, not a feature of reality itself. But for many people, this solution feels unsatisfying. It doesn't match how we actually use these concepts in everyday life. We don't typically think there's some exact number of hairs that separates a bald person from a non-bald person. We recognize that it's a gradual transition. The implications of the Sorites paradox go far beyond philosophical debates. It has real-world consequences in fields like law and medicine, where we often need to make clear distinctions based on vague criteria. For example, in legal contexts, the ambiguity of terms can lead to significant consequences. Small, incremental changes in a situation can create uncertainty about how laws should be applied, echoing the structure of the Sorites paradox. In medicine, doctors often have to make decisions based on criteria that aren't always clear-cut. When is a tumor large enough to require surgery? At what point does occasional forgetfulness become dementia? These are Sorites-like problems that healthcare professionals grapple with every day. The Sorites paradox also raises important questions about language and meaning. It suggests that many of our concepts are inherently vague and resistant to strict classification. This vagueness isn't just a quirk of language. It reflects the complexity of the world we're trying to describe. Some philosophers have proposed an approach called contextualism to deal with this vagueness. This view suggests that the truth value of statements about vague terms depends on the context in which they're made. So whether something counts as a heap or not might depend on the situation, the speaker's intentions, and other contextual factors. Another interesting approach is called supervaluationism. This theory suggests that while vague terms may not have precise boundaries, we can still reason about them consistently by considering all possible ways of making them precise. It's a bit like saying, we may not know exactly where the boundary is, but we can still talk about heaps in a meaningful way. The Sorites paradox even touches on ethical questions. It's related to the idea of gradualism in ethics, the notion that small changes over time can lead to significant differences in ethical considerations. For example, is there a precise point at which telling small lies becomes unethical? Or at what exact point does environmental degradation become morally wrong? These are Sorites-like problems in the realm of ethics. We've seen how small changes can lead to big ethical dilemmas. But what happens when trying to predict the future actually changes it? Imagine being told you're going to be surprised, but then using that very information to prove it's impossible. This mind-bending scenario is at the heart of our next paradox, and it's about to make you question everything you think you know about knowledge and certainty. The unexpected hanging paradox, also known as the unexpected examination paradox, is a real brain twister that challenges our understanding of prediction and surprise. It all starts with a judge telling a prisoner that he's going to be hanged at noon on one weekday in the following week. But here's the catch. The execution will be a surprise to the prisoner. He won't know which day it's going to happen until the executioner knocks on his cell door at noon that day. Now, you might think the prisoner would just sit there nervously waiting for his fate. But no, this prisoner is pretty clever. He starts to reason through the situation. He thinks, okay, if I haven't been hanged by Thursday night, then it would have to be Friday. But that wouldn't be a surprise, would it? So it can't be Friday. And then he realizes, wait a minute, if it can't be Friday, then if I make it to Wednesday night, I'd know it has to be Thursday. But that wouldn't be a surprise either. You can probably see where this is going. The prisoner keeps working backwards through the week, eliminating Thursday, then Wednesday, Tuesday, and even Monday. By the time he's done with his logical deduction, he's convinced himself that he can't be hanged at all if it's supposed to be a surprise. He's feeling pretty good about his clever reasoning. But here's where it gets really twisted. If the prisoner truly believes he won't be hanged at all, then any day would come as a complete surprise. So the judge's sentence can actually be carried out after all, and it would still fulfill the condition of being unexpected. It's like the prisoner's very certainty that he won't be hanged is what makes it possible for him to be hanged unexpectedly. This paradox is extra tricky because it involves knowledge about knowledge. The prisoner's knowledge of the surprise condition affects the very thing he's trying to predict. It's not just about what's going to happen, but about what he knows about what's going to happen. It's like a weird loop of logic that keeps folding back on itself. The unexpected. Hanging paradox has some pretty interesting implications when we start thinking about how we make decisions in uncertain situations. It's related to something called epistemic uncertainty, which is a fancy way of saying uncertainty about what we know. In this case, the prisoner's incomplete knowledge about when the hanging will happen leads him to logically eliminate all possible days, but the hanging can still occur unexpectedly. This paradox also touches on some ideas in decision theory, which is all about how we make choices when we're not sure what's going to happen. It reminds us that we need to consider uncertainty and the potential for unexpected outcomes when we're trying to make decisions or predictions. One of the really interesting things about this paradox is how it shows the limitations of static reasoning models. That's just a fancy way of saying that when we try to predict things that involve elements of surprise, our usual way of thinking through problems step by step might not always work. Some people have suggested that we might need to use dynamic prediction models instead, which can change and update as new information comes in. When we start thinking about the philosophical implications of this paradox, it gets even more mind-bending. It makes us question the nature of reality and how we perceive it. We like to think that if we just use logic and reason, we can figure everything out. But this paradox challenges that idea. It shows us that sometimes our logical frameworks don't quite match up with the unpredictable nature of actual events. It's kind of like when you're watching a really good mystery show and you think you've got it all figured out. You've analyzed all the clues, you've ruled out all the suspects except one, and you're absolutely certain you know who the culprit is. But then, in the last 5 minutes of the episode, there's a twist that completely blindsides you. The unexpected hanging paradox is like that twist, reminding us that sometimes the very act of prediction can make that prediction impossible. As we keep exploring these paradoxes, we're going to see this theme of self-defeating knowledge pop up again and again in different forms. It's like the universe has a sense of humor, always ready to pull the rug out from under us just when we think we've got everything figured out. Yeah, we've seen how self-defeating knowledge can twist our minds, but what if the very act of creating something actually caused it to exist in the first place? The bootstrap paradox is about to make our brains do somersaults as we explore a world where cause and effect swap places. This isn't just another mind bender, it's a paradox that challenges the very foundations of how we understand time and creativity. Imagine you're a time traveler and a huge fan of Beethoven. You've got all his symphonies memorized and you can't wait to meet the musical genius in person. So you hop in your time machine and zip back to 18th century Vienna, ready to be starstruck. But when you get there, you find out that nobody's ever heard of Beethoven. He doesn't exist. Talk about a plot twist, right? Now, you're faced with a dilemma. You've got all this incredible music in your head, and you know it's going to change the world. So what do? You decide to publish it yourself. You write down every note, every crescendo, every beautiful melody that you remember from the future. And just like that, Beethoven's music is born, but not from Beethoven himself. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and a young music lover discovers these amazing symphonies. They're so inspired that they build a time machine just so they can go back and meet the composer. And guess what? That music lover is you. The whole cycle starts all over again, creating a loop where the music has no original creator. It exists because it was brought from the future, but it only exists in the future because it was brought to the past. Mind-blowing, right? This scenario is what we call the bootstrap paradox. It's named after the phrase, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which is basically an impossible task. But in this time travel scenario, it seems to happen. The information or object involved in a bootstrap paradox becomes its own cause, creating a circular loop of causality that has no clear beginning or end. Now, let's dive a bit deeper into what this paradox really means. In our normal, everyday world, we're used to things happening in a certain order. Cause comes before effect. You plant a seed, then a tree grows. You write a song, then people hear it. But the bootstrap paradox throws all of that out the window. In our Beethoven example, what's the cause and what's the effect? The music exists because you brought it from the future, but it only exists in the future because you brought it to the past. It's like a chicken and egg problem, but on a cosmic scale. This paradox isn't just a fun story idea for science fiction writers, although they do love it. It raises some serious questions about the nature of information and the possibility of time travel. Think about it: if information can exist without being created, what does that mean for our understanding of creativity and originality? Can ideas truly come from nowhere? The bootstrap paradox also messes with our understanding of cause and effect in a big way. In classical physics, we typically view time as linear, with a clear progression from past to present to future. But this paradox introduces a non-linear perspective, where events can occur without a clear cause or origin. This challenges the principle that every effect must have a cause, which is pretty much the foundation of how we understand the world around us. Some physicists argue that paradoxes like this make backwards time travel impossible. After all, if time travel leads to these kinds of logical impossibilities, maybe it just can't happen. But others aren't so quick to dismiss the idea. They suggest that it might be possible within a many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. In this view, different timelines could branch off from each decision or event, potentially allowing for these paradoxical situations to exist without breaking the universe. The bootstrap paradox also pops up in discussions about the nature of information itself. In our Beethoven example, the information, the musical compositions, seems to exist in a closed time-like curve, with no clear point of origin. This raises some mind-bending questions about whether information can be created or destroyed, or if it's something that just exists, waiting to be discovered. And it's not just about music or time travel. This paradox can apply to all sorts of situations involving information or ideas. What if you traveled back in time and gave yourself the idea for the time machine that allowed you to travel back in the first place? Or what if you went back and inspired a young Stephen Hawking with knowledge from his own future books? The possibilities are endless, and each one makes you question the nature of creativity, discovery, and the flow of time itself. In the world of physics and philosophy, the bootstrap paradox is more than just a fun thought experiment. It's a challenge to our understanding of causality, the nature of time, and the limits of human knowledge. It forces us to confront the possibility that our linear, cause and effect view of the universe might not be the whole story. There could be loops and cycles in time that we can't even begin to comprehend with our limited three-dimensional perspective. Just when you thought time travel couldn't get any more mind-bending, along comes a paradox that makes you question whether you'd even survive the trip. The grandfather paradox isn't just about family drama. It's a logic-defying scenario that could unravel the entire universe. This isn't your typical what-if scenario. It's a cosmic riddle that has scientists scratching their heads and questioning if time travel to the past is even possible. So here's the deal. Imagine you hop in a time machine and zip back to the past. But instead of just observing history or maybe buying some vintage records, you accidentally prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. Oops. Suddenly you've created a situation where your parent would never be born, and by extension, neither would you. It's like accidentally erasing yourself from existence. But wait a second. If you were never born, how could you have traveled back in time in the first place? If you don't exist, you can't go back in time. But if you don't go back in time, you will exist. It's enough to make your brain feel like it's tied in knots. This paradox creates a logical loop that seems impossible to resolve. It's not just a fun thought experiment. It's a classic example of how time travel to the past could lead to some serious contradictions. Some scientists look at this paradox and say, nope, this is why backwards time travel is impossible. They argue that if it could happen, it would violate the principle of causality, the idea that causes must come before effects. In our normal experience, things happen in a nice, orderly sequence. But the grandfather paradox throws that all out the window, suggesting a world where effects can precede their causes. It's like trying to bake a cake before you've even bought the ingredients. But not everyone is ready to give up on the dream of visiting the past. Some clever folks have come up with potential solutions to this mind-bending problem. One popular idea is the many worlds interpretation. According to this theory, when you travel back in time and change something, you're not actually changing your own past. Instead, you're creating a whole new timeline or parallel universe. So in this new timeline, sure, you've prevented your grandparents from meeting. But the you that traveled back in time still exists, because you came from the original timeline where everything happened as it should. It's like the universe has a built-in safety net to prevent paradoxes. You can mess around in the past all you want, but you're just creating new branches of reality rather than erasing your own existence. It's a neat solution, but it does raise some pretty wild questions about the nature of reality and whether there could be infinite versions of ourselves out there in different timelines. Another idea that's been proposed is the Novikov self-consistency principle. This suggests that the universe somehow self-corrects to prevent paradoxes. It's like the fabric of reality itself conspires to make sure that no matter what a time traveler does in the past, the overall timeline remains consistent. So maybe every time you try to prevent your grandparents from meeting, something would always get in the way. You might trip and fall, or your time machine might malfunction, or your grandparents might meet in a different way. The universe would ensure that the essential events that led to your existence still happen, no matter what. It's worth noting that the grandfather paradox is closely related to the bootstrap paradox we discussed earlier. Both of these mind benders involve circular causality and the logical problems of backwards time travel. They challenge our understanding of cause and effect, making us question whether our linear view of time is really all there is to the story. The grandfather paradox isn't just a fun puzzle for science fiction writers. It has some serious implications for our understanding of physics and the nature of time itself. If time travel to the past is possible, it might work in ways that completely defy our usual understanding of cause and effect. We might have to rethink everything we know about how the universe operates. This paradox also raises some pretty deep philosophical questions. It makes us ponder the nature of free will and determinism. If you traveled to the past, would you even be capable of changing anything? Or would the universe always find a way to maintain consistency? And if you could change things, what does that mean for our understanding of fate and destiny? The grandfather paradox is more than just a theoretical problem. It's a challenge to our very conception of reality. It forces us to confront the possibility that time might not be the simple, linear progression we experience in our day-to-day lives. Instead, it could be something far more complex and mysterious, full of loops, branches, and interconnections that we can barely begin to comprehend. We've explored some mind-bending paradoxes already, but now we're going to look at one that challenges something we all take for granted every single day: the simple act of moving from one place to another. Zeno's paradoxes, named after the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea, are a set of thought experiments that seem to prove that motion itself is impossible. It's a wild idea, right? We know we can move around, but these paradoxes make us question the very nature of movement and space. The most famous of Zeno's paradoxes is called the dichotomy paradox, and it goes something like this. Imagine you want to walk across a room. Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? But here's the catch. Before you can get to the other side of the room, you have to get halfway there first. Okay, that makes sense. But before you can get halfway, you need to get a quarter of the way there. And before a quarter, you need to get an eighth of the way there. This keeps going on, getting smaller and smaller, but never actually reaching zero. So here's the problem. If there are infinitely many points you need to reach before you can cross the room, how can you ever even start moving? It's like you're stuck at the starting line, unable to take that first step because there's always another fraction of distance you need to cover first. It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it? But wait, it gets even weirder. Another one of Zeno's paradoxes is called Achilles and the tortoise. In this scenario, we've got the legendary Greek hero Achilles in a race with a tortoise. Now, we all know Achilles is way faster than a tortoise, right? But Zeno argues that Achilles can never actually catch up to the tortoise if the tortoise gets a head start. Here's how it works. By the time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise will have moved a little bit further ahead. Then when Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise will have moved again. This keeps happening over and over, with Achilles always playing catch-up but never quite making it. It sounds ridiculous because we know faster runners can overtake slower ones all the time, but that's the beauty of these paradoxes. They make us question things we usually take for granted. These paradoxes were a big deal back in ancient Greece. They challenged how philosophers understood space, time, and infinity. And you know what's really cool? People are still talking about them today. Mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists are still grappling with the ideas Zeno put forward over 2,000 years ago. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but we know motion is possible. We do it all the time. So what gives? Well, that's the million-dollar question. One way people have tried to resolve these paradoxes is through calculus. Calculus gives us tools to deal with infinite series, which is basically what Zeno's paradoxes are describing. But some people argue that using math to solve the problem misses the point Zeno was trying to make. They say he wasn't really trying to prove motion was impossible, but instead was pointing out problems with how we think about space and time. If you're feeling a bit of déjà vu right now, that's because Zeno's paradoxes are actually related to something we talked about earlier, the Sorites paradox. Remember that one? It was all about how many grains of sand it takes to make a heap. Both of these paradoxes deal with the tricky problem of using our logical, step-by-step way of thinking to understand things that are continuous and don't have clear boundaries. What's really fascinating about Zeno's paradoxes is how they show us that our common-sense understanding of the world can lead us to some pretty wild conclusions if we push it far enough. We all have this intuitive sense of how movement works. We don't usually think about all the infinitely small steps involved in walking across a room. But when we do start to break it down like that, suddenly something as simple as moving from point A to point B starts to seem impossible. These paradoxes aren't just ancient philosophy trivia, though. They've had a big impact on how we think about motion and infinity in mathematics and physics. The idea of infinite divisibility that Zeno brings up in the dichotomy paradox is something that's still relevant in fields like quantum mechanics and the study of the very, very small. And here's another cool thing about Zeno's paradoxes. They highlight how our perception of the world doesn't always match up with the underlying reality. We experience motion as a smooth, continuous thing. But when we start to analyze it closely, we run into all sorts of weird problems and contradictions. It's a reminder that the world is often more complex and mysterious than it appears on the surface. Just when you thought paradoxes couldn't get any weirder, along comes a mathematical proof that seems to violate the laws of physics. Imagine cutting a ball into pieces and reassembling them into two identical copies of the original. Sounds impossible, right? Well, in the realm of abstract mathematics, the Banach-Tarski paradox does exactly that. This mind-bending theorem, proved in 1924 by Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, suggests that it's possible to take a solid ball, cut it into a finite number of pieces, and then reassemble those pieces into two identical copies of the original ball. Now, you might be thinking, hold up, that can't be right. What about conservation of matter? And you'd be absolutely correct if we were talking about the physical world. The key to understanding this paradox lies in the nature of the pieces and what we mean by cut in this context. These aren't physical cuts like you'd make with a knife. They're mathematical divisions that create sets with some pretty bizarre properties. The proof of the Banach-Tarski paradox relies on some pretty wild mathematical concepts. It involves sets of points with strange properties and uses something called the axiom of choice. Now, the axiom of choice is a controversial principle in set theory that allows for the selection of elements from an infinite number of sets. It's essential for constructing the paradoxical pieces in the Banach-Tarski theorem. One of the strangest aspects of this paradox is that it deals with unmeasurable sets. These are mathematical constructs that don't have a well-defined volume. It's hard to wrap our heads around because, in the physical world, everything has a measurable volume. But in the realm of abstract mathematics, we can create these weird sets that defy our intuitions about space and measurement. It's important to note that this paradox doesn't apply to the physical world. You can't actually cut a pea into pieces and reassemble it into something the size of the sun. The Banach-Tarski paradox is purely a mathematical result that reveals the counterintuitive consequences of certain mathematical principles, particularly when we're dealing with infinite sets. This paradox has sparked some pretty heated debates in the mathematical community. Some mathematicians see the Banach-Tarski paradox as a reason to reject the axiom of choice altogether. They argue that if a mathematical principle leads to such an absurd conclusion, maybe we shouldn't accept it as valid. Others, however, see it as a fascinating quirk of infinite sets, a reminder that when we're dealing with infinity, our intuitions often lead us astray. The Banach-Tarski paradox isn't an isolated oddity in mathematics. It's related to other strange results in a field called measure theory. For example, there's another mind-bending theorem that shows you can cover a sphere with a countable number of arbitrarily small patches. These results further complicate our understanding of volume and space in the abstract mathematical realm. What's really interesting about the Banach-Tarski paradox is how it extends into philosophical discussions about the nature of mathematics and reality. It prompts questions about the limits of mathematical reasoning and the nature of existence itself. Can we trust mathematical results that seem to contradict our physical reality? Or does this paradox reveal something fundamental about the limitations of our understanding? In a way, the Banach-Tarski paradox serves as a humbling reminder of how little we truly understand about the universe. Just when we think we've got a handle on things, along comes a mathematical proof that turns our understanding upside down. It challenges us to question our assumptions and pushes the boundaries of what we consider possible. As we continue to explore these mind-bending paradoxes, we're going to see more and more examples of how mathematics can challenge our understanding of reality in surprising ways. The Banach-Tarski paradox is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the weird and wonderful world of mathematical abstractions. Have you ever looked up at the night sky and wondered, where is everybody? This simple question lies at the heart of one of the most perplexing paradoxes in modern science. We're talking about the Fermi paradox, named after the brilliant physicist Enrico Fermi. It's a cosmic conundrum that's been puzzling scientists and space enthusiasts for decades, and it might just keep you up at night. The Fermi paradox is all about the apparent contradiction between the high probability of extraterrestrial civilizations existing and the complete lack of evidence for their existence. When we look at the numbers, it seems like the universe should be teeming with life. Our galaxy alone has billions of stars, and we now know that many of these stars have planets orbiting them. Some of these planets are even in the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold, just right for life as we know it to exist. So, with all these potential alien homes out there, why haven't we encountered any signs of extraterrestrial intelligence? No radio signals, no space probes, no alien tourists asking for directions to the nearest intergalactic rest stop. It's like throwing a massive party and nobody shows up. What gives? Well, scientists and thinkers have been scratching their heads over this one for a while, and they've come up with some pretty interesting possible explanations. One idea is that maybe interstellar travel is just too darn difficult. Even for super advanced alien civilizations, the vast distances between stars might be too much to overcome. It's like trying to swim across the Pacific Ocean. Theoretically possible, but in practice, not so much. Another possibility is a bit more grim. What if advanced civilizations have a tendency to destroy themselves before they can establish contact with others? It's a sobering thought, but given our own planet's history of conflicts and environmental challenges, it's not entirely far-fetched. Maybe aliens are out there, but they're too busy dealing with their own alien problems to drop us a line. Some scientists have suggested that we might not be looking for extraterrestrial life in the right ways. It's possible that alien civilizations are communicating in forms we can't even detect. Maybe they're using some advanced form of quantum entanglement to chat across light years, while we're still shouting into space with radio waves. It's like trying to pick up a Wi-Fi signal with a walkie-talkie. We might just not have the right equipment. There's also the intriguing possibility that alien civilizations are deliberately avoiding contact with us. Maybe they've got some kind of galactic prime directive, like in Star Trek, where they're not supposed to interfere with less advanced civilizations. Or maybe they've seen our reality TV shows and decided they want nothing to do with us. Can't really blame them for that one. But here's a thought that's both exciting and a little scary. What if we're the first? It's possible that life, especially intelligent life, is much rarer than we think. Maybe we're the first civilization in our neck of the cosmic woods to reach this level of technological development. If that's the case, it would explain the silence we're hearing from space, but it would also put a lot of pressure on us. We'd be the trailblazers, the first explorers, in a vast cosmic frontier. The implications of the Fermi paradox go way beyond just the search for alien life. It raises some pretty fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, the future of humanity, and our place in the universe. Are we alone? Are we the first? Are we the last? Each possibility comes with its own set of mind-bending implications. If we're alone, that means the entire universe is our playground, waiting for us to explore and colonize. But it also means we're the only ones carrying the torch of consciousness in a vast, dark cosmos. Talk about pressure. If we're the first, we might be setting the stage for all future civilizations. Our actions now could shape the destiny of life in the galaxy. No big deal, right? And if we're the last? Well, that's a pretty sobering thought. It would mean that whatever wiped out all the other civilizations might be coming for us too. Kind of puts our petty human squabbles into perspective, doesn't it? The Fermi paradox is a perfect example of how sometimes the absence of evidence can be just as thought-provoking as its presence. It's a paradox that forces us to confront our place in the universe and the nature of existence itself. Are we significant, or are we just a tiny blip in the cosmic timeline? Are we destined for greatness among the stars, or are we doomed to remain forever earthbound? These are the kinds of questions that the Fermi paradox raises, and they're the kind of questions that can keep you pondering long into the night. It's a paradox that reminds us of how much we still have to learn about the universe and our place in it. Just when you thought the universe couldn't get any weirder, we're about to dive into a theory that makes the Fermi paradox look like child's play. Imagine a reality where your morning coffee, your favorite song, and even your deepest thoughts are all part of a vast computer program. Sound crazy? Well, some of the brightest minds of our time don't think so. This mind-bending idea is known as the simulation hypothesis, and it's about to challenge everything you think you know about reality. The simulation hypothesis was proposed by philosopher Nick Bostrom back in 2003, and it's been messing with people's heads ever since. The basic idea is that our entire reality might be nothing more than a computer simulation created by some super advanced civilization. Now, you might be thinking, come on, that's just sci-fi nonsense, but hear me out. Bostrom's argument is actually pretty logical when you break it down. He starts with the idea that if it's possible to create simulations that are indistinguishable from reality, and if advanced civilizations would likely create many of these simulations, then it follows that we're probably living in one right now. It's like a cosmic version of the old, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, saying, except in this case it's, if it looks like reality and feels like reality, it's probably a simulation. But here's where things get really trippy. If we are in a simulation, how can we trust our own reasoning about whether we're in a simulation or not? Our thoughts, our logic, even our ability to question our reality could all just be part of the program. It's like trying to debug a computer program from inside the program itself. This creates a paradox that's enough to make your brain do somersaults. Now, you might think this is all just wild speculation, but some pretty heavy hitters in the science and tech world take this idea seriously. Elon Musk, the guy behind Tesla, and SpaceX has famously stated that the chance we're not in a simulation is 1 in billions. That's a pretty bold claim from someone who's generally considered to be pretty smart. The simulation hypothesis isn't entirely new, though. It's related to some older philosophical ideas that have been messing with people's heads for centuries. Remember Descartes and his whole "I think, therefore I am" thing? Well, he also came up with this idea of an evil demon that could be tricking us into believing in a false reality. There's also the brain in a vat thought experiment, which imagines our brains floating in some nutrient soup while being fed false sensory information. The simulation hypothesis is like the high-tech 21st century version of these mind benders. But let's take a step back and think about what this hypothesis really means for us if it's true. It has some pretty wild implications for our understanding of consciousness, free will, and the nature of existence itself. If we're in a simulation, what does that mean for our sense of self? Are our thoughts and feelings really our own, or are they just part of the program? Do we actually have free will, or are we just following a predetermined script? These are the kinds of questions that can keep you up at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the ceiling is even real. Some scientists have actually proposed ways to test whether we're in a simulation. One idea is to look for glitches in the laws of physics, kind of like how you might spot a glitch in a video game. But these tests face some pretty significant challenges. For one thing, if we're in a simulation that's advanced enough to fool us completely, would we even be able to detect these glitches? And if we did find something that looked like a glitch, how would we know it wasn't just some aspect of reality we don't understand yet? The simulation hypothesis really challenges our most fundamental assumptions about reality. It suggests that our entire universe, from the tiniest subatomic particle to the largest galaxy, might be nothing more than a construct in some cosmic computer. It's an idea that's both fascinating and terrifying at the same time. As we near the end of our journey through paradoxes, we see how they push us to question everything, even the nature of existence itself. The simulation hypothesis is like the ultimate paradox, taking all the mind-bending qualities of the paradoxes we've explored and cranking them up to 11. It forces us to confront the possibility that everything we think we know about reality might be an illusion. Just when we thought we'd explored the deepest corners of paradoxical thinking, along comes a mind-bender that makes us question the very nature of choice itself. Newcomb's paradox takes us on a wild ride through the realms of free will, determinism, and rational decision-making, all while throwing in a dash of time-bending chaos for good measure. This isn't just another brain teaser. It's a philosophical puzzle that's been keeping economists, computer scientists, and philosophers up at night for decades. So picture this. You're standing in front of two boxes. Box A is transparent, and you can see it contains a cool $1,000. Box B, on the other hand, is a mystery. It's either empty or packed with $1 million. Now here's where things get interesting. You've got two options. You can either take both boxes or just go for box B. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, hold on to your hats, because there's a twist that's about to blow your mind. There's this super intelligent being, let's call it the predictor, who's already figured out what you're going to choose. If the predictor thinks you're going to take just box B, it's put $1 million in there. But if it thinks you're going to get greedy and grab both boxes, it's left box B empty. The kicker? This predictor is never wrong. It's like it can see into the future or read your mind or something. Now we're in a real pickle. On one hand, logic tells us to take both boxes. After all, whatever's in box B is already there, so why not snag that extra grand from box A? But here's the rub. If you think like that, you're probably going to end up with just $1,000 instead of a cool $1 million. It's like the universe is punishing you for being too clever. This is where Newcomb's paradox really starts to mess with our heads. It challenges everything we think we know about making rational decisions. In most situations, more options are better, right? But in this case, limiting yourself to just one box might actually be the smart move. It's like the game is rigged against people who try to outsmart it. But wait, it gets even weirder. This paradox isn't just about making the right choice. It's about whether we can even make choices at all. If this predictor can always guess what we're going to do, does that mean our decisions are predetermined? Are we just puppets acting out a script that's already been written? It's enough to make you question everything you thought you knew about free will. And let's not forget about the time-bending aspect of all this. How can a choice we make now affect something that's already happened in the past? It's like we're stuck in some kind of causal loop, where the future is influencing the past. If you're feeling a bit of déjà vu, that's because this paradox shares some DNA with those mind-twisting time travel scenarios we talked about earlier. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what does this all mean in the real world? Well, Newcomb's paradox isn't just some abstract thought experiment. It's got real implications for how we think about decision-making in all sorts of fields. Game theorists and economists have been scratching their heads over this one for years, trying to figure out what it means for strategic thinking and rational choice. Some folks argue that the only sensible move is to just take box B. They say it's all about maximizing your expected outcome. If you always choose box B, you're more likely to walk away with $1 million than if you always go for both boxes. It's like playing the odds, even if it doesn't feel totally logical in the moment. But then you've got the other camp who insist that taking both boxes is the only way to go. They argue that by the time you're making your choice, the money is either there or it's not. Your decision can't change what's already happened, so you might as well grab that extra $1,000 while you can. The more you think about it, the more Newcomb's paradox starts to feel like a test of our most basic assumptions about how the world works. It's pushing us to question things we usually take for granted, like the idea that causes always come before effects, or that we have the power to shape our own destinies. In a way, this paradox is the perfect capstone to our journey through the world of mind-bending puzzles. It takes all the themes we've been exploring – logic, causality, free will, determinism – and smashes them together in one brain, melting scenario. It's like the ultimate paradox, combining elements of time travel, omniscience, and decision theory into one package that defies easy explanation. You might think having unlimited power would be the ultimate solution to every problem. But what if it actually created the biggest puzzle of all? Welcome to the mind-bending world of the omnipotence paradox, where we're about to challenge the very concept of absolute power. This isn't just about heavy rocks. It's about the weight of logic crushing our ideas of the infinite. The omnipotence paradox poses a deceptively simple question. Can an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that they can't lift it? At first glance, you might think, of course they can. They're all-powerful. But here's where things get tricky. If they can create such a stone, it means there's something they can't do. Lift it. And if they can't create it, well, that's also something they can't do. It's like a logical trap that's been catching philosophers and theologians in its jaws for centuries. This paradox isn't just some abstract thought experiment. It's got deep roots in how we think about power and possibility. In many religions and philosophical traditions, the idea of an all-powerful, omnipotent being is pretty common. But when we really start to unpack what all-powerful means, we run into some serious head-scratchers. The tension at the heart of this paradox is that it seems to make omnipotence self-contradictory. No matter which way you slice it, there's always going to be something an all-powerful being can't do. It's like trying to imagine a square circle or a married bachelor. The very concept seems to break down under scrutiny. But don't think this paradox is just some modern brain teaser. Philosophers and theologians have been wrestling with this one for a long, long time. It's not just about lifting rocks. It's about understanding the nature of power, infinity, and the limits of what's possible. Some smart folks have tried to wriggle out of this paradox by arguing that we're misunderstanding what omnipotence really means. They suggest that being all-powerful doesn't necessarily mean being able to do things that are logically impossible. After all, even if you had all the power in the universe, you couldn't make 2 + 2 5, right? So maybe the ability to create an unliftable stone falls into that category of logical impossibilities. But then we've got another group of thinkers who take things in a totally different direction. They propose that a truly omnipotent being could actually change the laws of logic themselves. In this view, an all-powerful entity could somehow make it possible to both create the unliftable stone and lift it. It's a mind-bending thought that really pushes the boundaries of what we consider possible. When you think about it, the omnipotence paradox has a lot in common with some of the other brain twisters we've explored. Take the liar's paradox, for instance. Both of these paradoxes involve self-reference and really test the limits of what we can express with logical statements. They force us to question whether our normal ways of thinking about truth and power are really up to the task of dealing with these extreme cases. But this paradox isn't just some abstract philosophical puzzle. It's got some pretty interesting implications beyond the realm of theology. It makes us think hard about the nature of power itself. Is there such a thing as absolute power? Or does power always come with limitations? It also touches on questions about the limits of possibility. Are there things that are truly impossible, even for the most powerful being imaginable? And then there's the relationship between logic and reality. We use logic to make sense of the world around us, but paradoxes like this one make us wonder if there might be aspects of reality that just can't be captured by our logical systems. It's a humbling thought that reminds us of the limits of human understanding. The omnipotence paradox is a perfect example of how even our most fundamental concepts can break down when we push them to their logical extremes. It shows us that the idea of unlimited power might have its own built-in limitations. It's like trying to imagine the largest possible number. As soon as you think you've got it, you can always add one more, right? As we wrap up our journey through these mind-bending paradoxes, it's clear that they all share a common thread. Whether we're talking about time travel, infinity, or omnipotence, these paradoxes consistently push us to the very edges of logic and understanding. They challenge our most basic assumptions about how the world works and force us to reconsider ideas we might have taken for granted. All right, let's set sail on this philosophical journey with the ship of Theseus. This ancient Greek paradox has been puzzling minds for centuries, and it's still making waves in modern discussions about identity and change. The story goes that there was this famous ship in Athens that belonged to the legendary hero Theseus. It was a symbol of pride for the city, and they wanted to keep it around for as long as possible. But here's where things get interesting. Over time, parts of the ship started to wear down. You know how it is with old things. They need a bit of maintenance. So the Athenians decided to replace the worn-out planks with new ones. No big deal, right? Well, that's what they thought at first. They kept replacing parts of the ship as needed, and before they knew it, every single piece of the original ship had been swapped out for a new one. Now, this is where our brains start to do mental backflips. Is this still the same ship of Theseus? On one hand, it looks exactly the same and serves the same purpose. But on the other hand, not a single atom of the original ship remains. It's like a really intense game of spot the difference, where everything is different, but nothing looks different. This paradox isn't just about boats, though. It makes us question what makes something truly itself. Is it the physical materials that something is made of, or is it something more abstract? Philosophers have been scratching their heads over this for ages, and there's still no clear consensus. Some say it's definitely the same ship because it's continued to exist in the same form and function without interruption. Others argue that it can't possibly be the same ship if all the original parts are gone. But here's where it gets even more mind-bending. We see this paradox playing out in our own lives all the time. Did you know that our bodies are constantly replacing cells? In fact, most of the cells in your body right now weren't there 7 years ago. So, in a way, we're all like the ship of Theseus. Our bodies are constantly changing, but we still feel like the same person. This brings us to the big question of personal identity. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Sure, you might look different, have different opinions, and even act differently, but there's still a sense of continuity. You still feel like you. But if everything about you has changed, what exactly is it that makes you you? The more we think about this, the fuzzier things get. It's like trying to grab a handful of fog. The harder you try to grasp it, the more it seems to slip away. But that's the beauty of paradoxes like this. They push our brains to their limits and force us to think in new ways. Now, you might be wondering if there's a resolution to all this. Well, I hate to break it to you, but there's no clear-cut answer. And that's okay. The real value of the ship of Theseus paradox isn't in finding a solution, but in the journey of thinking about it. It teaches us that identity is a complex, multifaceted thing that can't be boiled down to simple yes or no answers. This paradox has some pretty interesting real-world applications too. Think about classic cars that have had most of their parts replaced over time. Are they still considered original? Or what about famous landmarks that have been restored or rebuilt? The Ship of Theseus makes us question how we assign value and authenticity to things. It's also got some wild implications for the future. As we get better at replacing body parts with artificial ones, at what point does a person stop being human? If we could upload our consciousness to a computer, would that digital version still be us? These might sound like sci-fi scenarios, but they're questions we might have to grapple with sooner than we think. Alright, let's shift gears from ships to scissors and dive into a paradox that's anything but a simple trim. Picture a small town with one very particular rule about haircuts. It sounds straightforward enough, but this scenario stumped some of the greatest minds in philosophy and mathematics. How can a single haircut cause such a fuss? Well, we're about to unravel a hairy situation that had even brilliant thinkers scratching their heads. So here's the setup. We've got this town with one barber. Now, this isn't just any ordinary barber. This guy has a specific job. He shaves all and only those men in town who don't shave themselves. Sounds simple, right? But here's where things get tricky. Who shaves the barber? This mind-bending puzzle was actually cooked up by a philosopher named Bertrand Russell back in the early 20th century. Russell wasn't just trying to confuse people for fun. He was using this paradox to point out some serious issues in the world of mathematics, specifically in something called set theory. It's pretty wild to think that a question about haircuts could shake up the foundations of math, but that's exactly what happened. Let's break it down a bit. If the barber shaves himself, then he can't be the barber who only shaves those who don't shave themselves. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he's one of those guys who doesn't shave himself, so he has to shave himself. See how we're going in circles here? This is what we call a self-referential paradox, and it's the kind of thing that can make your brain feel like it's tied up in knots. Now, you might be thinking, come on, it's just a silly puzzle about a barber. What's the big deal? But here's the thing. This paradox actually revealed some pretty serious problems in how mathematicians were thinking about sets and logic at the time. It's like Russell found a loose thread, and when he pulled on it, a whole bunch of mathematical assumptions started to unravel. The more you try to solve this paradox, the more it seems to resist any kind of logical solution. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. Every time you think you've got it, it slips away. And that's kind of the point. Russell was showing that our usual ways of thinking about logic and sets just weren't cutting it when it came to dealing with these self-referential situations. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just some abstract problem that only matters to philosophers and mathematicians. We actually run into this kind of circular logic in everyday life all the time, we just might not realize it. Think about those situations where someone claims they're the best at something, but there's no real way to measure it. Or when a rule is set up in a way that it contradicts itself. These are all little versions of the barber's paradox playing out in the real world. In the world of computer science, this paradox has some pretty big implications too. Programmers have to be really careful about something called recursion, where a function calls itself. If they're not careful, they can end up creating the same kind of logical loop that we see in the barber's paradox. It's like the computer version of the barber trying to figure out if he should shave himself or not. So how do we deal with these kinds of paradoxes? Well, that's where things get really cool. Mathematicians and logicians had to come up with whole new ways of thinking about sets and logic to avoid these kinds of contradictions. They developed something called type theory, which is like a way of organizing sets into different levels to prevent them from containing themselves. It's kind of like making sure the barber isn't allowed to be in his own customer list. The barber's paradox isn't just a fun brain teaser. It's a reminder of how tricky language and logic can be. It shows us that sometimes the way we phrase things can create these logical traps that are really hard to escape from. And it's not just about hair or small towns. This paradox has implications for how we think about everything from computer programming to the nature of truth itself. Now, if you thought the barber's situation was mind-bending, wait until you hear about this cat. We're moving from logical loops to quantum leaps, where a single animal can exist in two completely opposite states at once. How is this even possible? It all comes down to a thought experiment that shook the foundations of physics and our understanding of reality itself. Back in 1935, a physicist named Erwin Schrödinger came up with a wild idea to challenge the concepts of quantum mechanics. He imagined a scenario where a cat is placed in a sealed box with a vial of poison. The twist? The vial has a 50% chance of being released based on some random quantum event. Now, this isn't your typical pet-sitting situation. It's a way to illustrate a mind-boggling concept called quantum superposition. So, what's the deal with quantum superposition? Well, it's this crazy idea in quantum mechanics that says a quantum system can exist in multiple states at the same time until someone observes it. It's like if you could be both asleep and awake until someone walks into your room and checks on you. Weird, right? Now, here's where things get really trippy. According to this thought experiment, until we open that box and take a look, that poor cat is considered to be both alive and dead at the same time. It's not just one or the other. It's both simultaneously. This isn't some magic trick or a case of Schrödinger being really bad at taking care of cats. It's actually a way to illustrate how things behave at the tiniest scales of reality. You might be thinking, okay, but what does this have to do with the real world? Well, it turns out that quantum physicists actually use math that treats things as being in multiple states at once. This isn't just some abstract concept. It has real-world applications. Think about quantum computing or quantum cryptography. These cutting-edge technologies rely on principles similar to what Schrödinger was trying to explain with his cat-in-a-box scenario. But let's take a step back and think about what this means for our understanding of reality. The Schrödinger's cat paradox isn't just about felines in precarious situations. It raises some pretty profound questions about the nature of reality and how observation plays a role in it. It's suggesting that the very act of measuring or observing something can change its state. That's wild to think about, right? It's like if looking at your dinner actually changed what was on your plate. This thought experiment has sparked some intense debates among physicists and philosophers. They've been arguing about what this means for our understanding of consciousness and reality itself. Some people think it implies that our consciousness somehow affects the physical world around us. Others argue that it just shows the limitations of our current understanding of quantum mechanics. One of the most mind-bending aspects of this paradox is how it challenges our intuitive understanding of cause and effect. In our everyday lives, we're used to things being in one state or another. A light is either on or off. A door is either open or closed. But in the quantum world, things can be in multiple states at once until they're observed. It's like the universe is playing a constant game of peekaboo with us, where things only decide what they are when we look at them. This paradox also highlights how different the quantum world is from the world we experience every day. In classical physics, the kind of physics that describes how balls roll down hills or how planets orbit the sun, things are much more straightforward. But when we start looking at the tiniest scales of reality, our usual rules just don't apply anymore. It's like we've stepped through the looking glass into a world where the normal laws of physics have gone on vacation. The more we think about Schrödinger's cat, the more we realize just how strange the universe really is. It's a reminder that reality might be far weirder and more complex than we ever imagined. And in a way, that's pretty exciting. It means there's still so much for us to discover and understand about the world around us. From cats in boxes to grains of sand, we're trading quantum weirdness for linguistic puzzles. Picture this. You're on a beach, picking up one grain of sand at a time. At what exact moment? Does your pile become a heap? This seemingly innocent question has been driving philosophers crazy for over 2,000 years. Welcome to the Sorites paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap. This mind-bender gets its name from the Greek word soros, which means heap. It's usually attributed to an ancient Greek philosopher called Eubulides of Miletus. He came up with this paradox to challenge our understanding of language and logic. The basic idea is pretty simple. One grain of sand isn't a heap, right? If you add another grain, it's still not a heap. You keep adding grains one by one, and at some point, you've got to have a heap. But when exactly does that happen? The tricky part is that there's no clear point where a pile suddenly transforms into a heap. It's a gradual change, and that's where things get messy. This isn't just about sand, though. The Sorite's paradox applies to all sorts of concepts we use in everyday life. When does a person become old? At what point does a town grow into a city? There's no exact line, and that's what makes this paradox so fascinating and frustrating. This paradox highlights a big problem in how we think and communicate. Our language often uses vague terms that don't have clear boundaries. We're comfortable with words like tall, rich, or old, but when we try to pin down exactly what they mean, we run into trouble. There's no specific height where someone suddenly becomes tall, no exact amount of money that makes a person rich, and no precise age when someone becomes old. Philosophers have been scratching their heads over this one for centuries, trying to figure out how to deal with vagueness in logical reasoning. Some of them have come up with pretty interesting ideas. For example, there's a view called epistemicism. This approach says that there actually is a precise point where a pile becomes a heap, but we just can't know what it is. It's like there's a magical number of grains that makes a heap, but it's impossible for us to figure out what that number is. Another way of looking at it is through something called fuzzy logic. This approach throws out the idea that statements have to be either completely true or completely false. Instead, it allows for degrees of truth. So a small pile of sand might be considered 30% a heap, while a larger pile might be 70% a heap. It's a way of dealing with the gradual nature of the change from pile to heap. There's also an approach called supervaluationism. This idea suggests that while vague terms might not have precise boundaries, we can still reason about them consistently by considering all the possible ways of making them precise. It's like saying, well, we don't know exactly where the line is, but we can think about all the possible places it could be. The Sorite's paradox isn't just some abstract puzzle for philosophers to argue about. It has real-world implications in fields where precise decision-making is crucial. Take law, for example. Legal terms like reasonable or sufficient can lead to tricky situations where it's not clear how the law should be applied. In medicine, doctors and families sometimes have to make tough decisions about end-of-life care, dealing with vague concepts like quality of life or terminal illness. This paradox even touches on ethical questions. Think about telling lies. One small lie might not seem like a big deal, but if you keep telling small lies, at what point does it become morally unacceptable? It's the same structure as the heap paradox, but with serious ethical implications. The more we think about the Sorite's paradox, the more we realize how many of our categories and definitions are kind of arbitrary. It shows us that reality is often more complex and nuanced than our language and thinking can easily capture. This doesn't mean we should throw out all our categories and definitions. After all, we need them to communicate and make sense of the world. But it does suggest that we should be cautious about drawing hard lines in continuous spectrums. And not just when you thought we were done with mind-bending concepts, we're about to race into another paradox that'll make you question the very nature of motion itself. Have you ever wondered if it's possible to lose a race even when you're faster than your opponent? Well, get ready to meet Achilles and his surprisingly formidable rival, a tortoise. This paradox was cooked up by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno, and it's been giving people headaches for over 2,000 years. Here's the setup. Achilles, known for his swift feet, decides to race a tortoise. Being a good sport, he gives the tortoise a head start. Now, you'd think Achilles would easily catch up and overtake the slow-moving tortoise, right? Well, Zeno's here to throw a wrench in that logic. Zeno argues that before Achilles can catch the tortoise, he first has to reach the point where the tortoise started. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved a bit further ahead. So Achilles has to reach that new point. But guess what? The tortoise has moved again. This keeps happening over and over, creating an infinite number of points Achilles has to cross. It's like trying to count to infinity. You can keep going, but you'll never actually get there. Now, this might sound a bit silly at first. We've all seen faster things overtake slower ones in real life. But Zeno's paradox isn't just about races. It's about the nature of motion itself. It makes us question how anything can move from one point to another if there are infinite points in between. It's like trying to watch every single frame of a movie before getting to the end. It seems impossible. This paradox touches on some really deep questions about the nature of space and time. Are they infinitely divisible? Can we keep cutting up distances and time intervals forever? Or is there a point where we hit some kind of limit? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They have real implications for how we understand the world around us. For a long time, this paradox stumped even the smartest thinkers. It wasn't until the development of calculus that mathematicians finally had the tools to tackle it head-on. They used the concept of limits and infinite series to show that even though there are infinitely many steps, the total distance and time can still be finite. It's a bit like adding up fractions. 1 to our 2 plus 1 to 4 plus 1 is 8 plus 1 to our 16 and so on. Even though you keep adding more and more numbers, the sum never quite reaches 1, but it gets really, really close. This mathematical solution is pretty cool, but it doesn't completely kill the philosophical questions Zeno raised. It's a great example of how our intuitions about the world can sometimes lead us astray. We tend to think of motion as smooth and continuous, but when we start breaking it down into smaller and smaller steps, things get really strange really fast. Zeno's paradox is more than just a quirky thought experiment. It's had a big impact on various fields of study. In mathematics, it pushed people to develop new ways of dealing with infinity and continuity. In philosophy, it sparked debates about the nature of reality and how we perceive it. Even in physics, where we now have a much better understanding of motion, Zeno's ideas still pop up when we start looking at things on a quantum scale. One of the coolest things about Zeno's paradox is how it shows us that reality can be a lot more complex than it seems at first glance. We might think we understand something as simple as motion, but when we really dig into it, we find all sorts of weird and wonderful complexities. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn and discover about the world around us. Even though we now have mathematical tools to resolve Zeno's paradox, it still challenges our perception of continuity. It makes us question whether our everyday experience of the world matches up with the underlying reality. Are things really as smooth and continuous as they appear? Or is that just how our brains interpret a much more complex and granular reality? Alright, let's dive into the mind-bending world of the grandfather paradox. This isn't just some wacky sci-fi plot device. It's a seriously tricky problem that's been giving scientists and philosophers major headaches for years. Imagine you've got a time machine, and you decide to take a little trip back to the past. But instead of just observing history or maybe grabbing a souvenir, you accidentally do something that stops your grandparents from ever meeting. Oops, now you've got a real problem on your hands. The grandfather paradox is all about the logical mess we get into when we start messing with the past. If you prevent your grandparents from meeting, you're basically erasing yourself from existence. But if you never existed, how could you have traveled back in time to stop them from meeting in the first place? It's like a snake eating its own tail. It just doesn't make sense. This paradox isn't just a fun thought experiment. It raises some pretty heavy questions about how time itself works. Is time something that's set in stone, or is it more flexible than we think? Can we change the past, or are we just along for the ride? Some scientists argue that the grandfather paradox is proof that backwards time travel is impossible. After all, if it leads to these kinds of logical contradictions, maybe it's just not something that can happen in our universe. But not everyone is ready to give up on time travel just yet. Some clever folks have come up with some pretty wild ideas to try and solve this paradox. One popular theory is the idea of parallel universes or alternate timelines. According to this idea, if you go back in time and change something, you're not actually changing your own past. Instead, you're creating a whole new timeline where things played out differently. So in this new timeline, maybe you don't exist, but the you from the original timeline is still kicking around. Another way of looking at it involves something called closed time-like curves. This is a fancy way of saying that events in the past are already part of a closed loop. So if you travel back in time, anything you do has already happened and is already part of the timeline. It's like you're an actor in a play, and even though it feels like you're making choices, the script has already been written. These ideas might sound like they belong in a sci-fi movie, and you're not wrong. The grandfather paradox has been a favorite of writers and filmmakers for decades. It's a great way to explore all sorts of interesting questions about free will, destiny, and the nature of reality. Plus, it's just plain fun to imagine all the crazy things that could happen if we could hop around in time. But even though we can't actually travel through time, at least not yet, the grandfather paradox is still super useful. It helps us think about cause and effect in new ways. In our everyday lives, we're used to things happening in a nice, orderly sequence. But when you start playing around with time travel, all of that goes out the window. It makes us question whether our intuitive understanding of how the world works is really accurate. The more we think about the grandfather paradox, the more we realize just how little we actually understand about time. We experience time as this constant, forward-moving thing. But is that really what it is? Or is it something way more complicated that our brains just aren't equipped to fully grasp? These are the kinds of big questions that keep physicists and philosophers up at night. Even though we can't actually travel back in time and prevent our own births, thankfully, that sounds like it would be pretty uncomfortable, the grandfather paradox is still super valuable. It helps us explore the concept of causality, the idea that one thing leads to another in a logical sequence. By pushing this idea to its limits, we can start to see where our understanding breaks down and where we might need to come up with new ways of thinking about the world. All right, let's dive into a mind-bending paradox that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about logic and prediction. Imagine you're sitting in class and your teacher announces there's going to be a surprise exam next week. Sounds pretty normal, right? Well, buckle up, because we're about to see how a group of students thought they had their teacher's plan all figured out, only to end up more surprised than ever. So here's the deal. The teacher says there's going to be a surprise exam sometime next week. The students, being the clever bunch they are, start thinking about how they can outsmart this whole surprise exam situation. They figure, okay, it can't be on Friday, because if it hasn't happened by Thursday, we'd know it's coming on Friday, and then it wouldn't be a surprise. Makes sense, right? But then they keep going with this logic. They realize that if it can't be on Friday, then it also can't be on Thursday. Because if it hasn't happened by Wednesday, they'd know it has to be on Thursday. And again, no surprise. They keep working backwards like this until they've eliminated every single day of the week. And that's when things get really weird. These students have used what seems like perfectly sound reasoning to conclude that the surprise exam can't happen at all. But here's the kicker. The exam can still happen, and it will still be a surprise. This is the unexpected exam paradox, and it's been making people's brains hurt for a long time. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, this isn't just about pop quizzes, is it? And you'd be absolutely right. This paradox is actually a deep dive into how we think about knowledge, prediction, and the nature of surprise itself. It's not just about exams, it's about how we reason about future events in general. Think about it. How often do we try to predict what's going to happen in our lives? We make plans, we set expectations, we try to prepare for every possibility. But the unexpected exam paradox shows us that sometimes, the more we try to outsmart the future, the more it can surprise us. This paradox has some pretty big implications for fields like game theory and strategic thinking. Imagine you're playing chess, trying to predict your opponent's moves, or you're a general, planning a military strategy, or heck, even if you're just trying to figure out what to wear tomorrow based on the weather forecast. In all these situations, we're dealing with incomplete information and trying to make predictions. But the unexpected exam paradox throws a wrench in the works. It suggests that there might be limits to how much we can rely on logical reasoning when it comes to predicting the future. Some philosophers argue that this paradox actually shows us the boundaries of logical reasoning about knowledge itself, and it gets even weirder. Some thinkers say that the paradox reveals problems with the very concept of surprise itself. I mean, think about it. What does it really mean for something to be a surprise? If we can predict it, it's not a surprise. But if we can't predict it at all, how can we even talk about it happening? The more we try to wrap our heads around this paradox, the more surprising it becomes. It's like one of those Russian nesting dolls where every time you think you've figured it out, there's another layer of confusion waiting inside. But here's the thing. Even though this paradox might make our brains feel like they're doing backflips, it's actually teaching us something really important. It's showing us that sometimes, trying to achieve perfect prediction can lead us into contradiction. In other words, the very act of trying to eliminate all surprise can create the conditions for surprise to happen. This paradox touches on some pretty deep philosophical concepts. It's related to ideas in decision theory, where people have to navigate uncertainty and the potential for unexpected outcomes. It shows us the limitations of static reasoning models. You know, those step-by-step logical processes we often rely on. There's also this thing called epistemic uncertainty at play here. That's a fancy way of saying that the student's incomplete knowledge leads them to eliminate all possible days for the exam, even though the exam can still occur unexpectedly. It's a reminder that we're often working with incomplete information, and that can lead us to some pretty wild conclusions. And let's not forget about confirmation bias. In this case, the students are seeking to confirm their belief that the exam can't occur by logically eliminating days. But that very process leads them to a flawed conclusion. It's a great example of how our brains can sometimes lead us astray, even when we think we're being super logical. All right, let's check into a hotel that's unlike any other you've ever seen. Imagine a place where the concept of no vacancy simply doesn't exist. Welcome to Hilbert's Hotel, where infinity throws all our rules out the window and challenges everything we thought we knew about numbers and space. This mind-bending thought experiment was introduced by mathematician David Hilbert back in 1924. He wanted to explore the nature of infinity, and boy, did he create a brain twister. Picture a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, stretching as far as the eye can see, and beyond. Now, here's the kicker. Every single one of those infinite rooms is occupied. You'd think there's no way to squeeze in even one more guest, right? Well, that's where things get really interesting. In Hilbert's Hotel, even when all rooms are occupied, it can still accommodate new guests. How? The manager simply asks each guest to move to the next room. So the person in room 1 moves to room 2, the person in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on. This creates a domino effect that goes on forever, freeing up room 1 for the new guest. It sounds impossible, but when you're dealing with infinity, the usual rules don't apply. But wait, it gets even crazier. What if an infinite number of new guests show up? No problem for Hilbert's Hotel. The manager just asks each current guest to move to twice their room number. So the person in room 1 moves to room 2, the person in room 2 moves to room 4, the person in room 3 moves to room 6, and so on. This leaves all the odd-numbered rooms free for the infinite new guests. It's like a cosmic game of musical chairs where everyone always gets a seat. This paradox really messes with our heads because it goes against everything we understand about numbers and space. In our everyday lives, if something's full, it's full. End of story. But Hilbert's Hotel shows us that when we're dealing with infinity, our intuitions about numbers completely break down. You can add to infinity and still have the same amount. It's like trying to add a drop of water to an endless ocean. It doesn't change the overall quantity. Now, you might be thinking, this is all well and good, but what's the point? Well, Hilbert's Hotel isn't just a fun brain teaser. It has some serious implications in mathematics, especially in set theory. Mathematicians use this concept to understand different types of infinity. Yeah, you heard that right. There's more than one kind of infinity. The paradox illustrates that different sizes of infinity exist. For example, the set of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, and so on, is countably infinite. That means you can list them in a sequence, even if that sequence goes on forever. But then there's the set of real numbers, which includes all the numbers between whole numbers like 1.5 or p. This set is uncountably infinite, meaning there are more real numbers than natural numbers. It's like saying one infinity is bigger than another, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. Hilbert's Hotel serves as a metaphor for understanding these different types of infinity. The guests in the hotel represent countable infinity. You can assign each guest a room number, even if you'd be counting forever. But if you tried to fit all the real numbers into the hotel, you'd run into trouble. There would always be numbers left over, no matter how you tried to arrange them. This concept isn't just abstract mathematical noodling either. It has real-world applications, particularly in computer science. Programmers deal with algorithms that handle potentially infinite data structures or processes all the time. Think about a program that generates prime numbers. It could theoretically go on forever. Understanding how to work with these infinities is crucial for designing efficient algorithms and managing computer resources. The idea of Hilbert's hotel even pops up in discussions about the nature of the universe. When physicists talk about infinite space or multiple universes, they encounter similar paradoxes. If the universe is infinite, could there be infinite copies of Earth out there? It's the kind of question that makes your brain feel like it's trying to escape your skull. From infinite hotels to finite prison cells, our next paradox brings us back down to Earth, but still messes with our minds. What if the most logical choice is actually the worst one? The prisoner's dilemma puts us in a situation where being smart might just be the dumbest move. This isn't just some theoretical game. It's a scenario that plays out in real life all the time, from business decisions to international politics. So here's the deal. Two prisoners are caught and separated. The police offer each of them a choice. They can either stay silent or betray their partner. If both stay silent, they both get a light sentence. If one betrays and the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free while the other gets a heavy sentence. But if they both betray each other, they both get a moderate sentence. Sounds simple, right? Well, this is where things get tricky. When we look at this situation, our first thought might be, obviously, I should betray my partner. After all, if you betray and they stay silent, you go free. And if they betray you, at least you didn't end up with the worst sentence by staying silent. It seems like betrayal is the smart move no matter what. But here's the kicker. If both prisoners think this way and betray each other, they both end up worse off than if they had cooperated and stayed silent. This paradox isn't just some abstract puzzle. We see it play out in the real world all the time. Think about businesses deciding whether to cooperate on pricing or undercut each other. Or countries trying to decide if they should work together on issues like climate change or arms reduction. In these situations, everyone would be better off if they cooperated, but the fear of being taken advantage of often leads to choices that make everyone worse off. What's really interesting is how people behave in real-life versions of the prisoner's dilemma. Studies have shown that we often don't act as rationally as the theory predicts. In experiments, people choose to cooperate more often than you'd expect. This suggests that there's more to our decision-making than just cold logic. Things like trust, social norms, and the possibility of future interactions all play a role in how we approach these situations. Game theorists have spent a lot of time studying the prisoner's dilemma, trying to figure out ways to encourage cooperation. One key insight is the importance of repeated interactions. When people know they'll have to deal with each other again in the future, they're more likely to cooperate. It's like the difference between how you might act in a one-off encounter versus how you treat your neighbors. You're probably nicer to the people you know you'll see again. This paradox really challenges our ideas about rationality and self-interest. We often think that doing what's best for ourselves is the smart move. But the prisoner's dilemma shows us that sometimes what's best for the individual can lead to the worst outcome for everyone. It's a powerful illustration of how complex social interactions can be, and why sometimes we need to think beyond our immediate self-interest. The more we dig into the prisoner's dilemma, the more we see how it applies to all sorts of situations in life. It comes up in everything from negotiating a salary to deciding whether to cheat on a test. Each time, we're faced with the temptation to act in our own interest, even though we know that if everyone did the same, we'd all be worse off. So how do we resolve this paradox? Well, one key is trust. When people trust each other, they're more likely to choose cooperation over betrayal. Another important factor is the expectation of future interactions. If you know you'll have to deal with the same people again and again, you're more likely to play nice. This is why building relationships and fostering a sense of community can be so important in overcoming these kinds of dilemmas. We've been wrestling with some pretty mind-bending paradoxes, but get ready for one that's going to make your brain do somersaults. Imagine a sentence that, just by existing, creates a logical loop that seems impossible to escape. That's exactly what we're dealing with when it comes to the liar's paradox. This isn't just some clever wordplay or a trick question. It's a puzzle that's been giving philosophers and logicians headaches for centuries. So here's the deal. Consider the sentence. This statement is false. Sounds simple enough, right? But when you really start thinking about it, things get weird fast. If the statement is true, then it's accurately describing itself as false. But if it's false, then it's actually true because it claims to be false. It's like a snake eating its own tail. There's no clear beginning or end to the logic. This paradox goes way back. One of the earliest examples we know about comes from a Greek philosopher named Epimenides. He famously said, "All Cretans are liars." Now, here's the kicker. Epimenides himself was from Crete. So if what he's saying is true, then he must be lying, which would make the statement false. But if it's false, then some Cretans must be truthful, potentially including Epimenides, which could make the statement true again. It's enough to make your head spin. In modern logic, we usually see the liar's paradox presented as, "This statement is false." It's a more streamlined version, but it packs the same punch when it comes to tying our brains in knots. What makes this paradox so tricky is that it challenges some of our most basic assumptions about how language and logic work. We usually think of statements as being either true or false. There's no in-between. But the liar's paradox throws a wrench in that idea. It creates a situation where we can't definitively say whether something is true or false. It's like trying to decide whether a light switch is on or off, only to find out it's somehow stuck in the middle. This isn't just some abstract problem that doesn't matter in the real world. The liar's paradox has some serious implications for how we think about truth, language, and even the foundations of mathematics and computer science. It exposes some limitations in our traditional logical systems and forces us to consider new ways of thinking about truth and meaning. Some really smart people have tried to tackle this paradox over the years. One approach comes from something called type theory, which was developed by the philosopher Bertrand Russell and others. They suggested creating a kind of hierarchy of types to avoid self-reference. It's like saying you can talk about things on the ground floor, but you need to go up a level to talk about talking about things on the ground floor. This helps prevent the kind of looping that happens in the liar's paradox. Another interesting approach is called dialetheism. This is a fancy way of saying that some statements can be both true and false at the same time. It's a pretty radical idea that goes against our usual either-or way of thinking, but it offers a way to deal with paradoxes like this one. In the world of computer science, the liar's paradox reminds us how important it is to be careful with self-reference and recursion when we're designing algorithms. If you're not careful, you can end up with programs that get stuck in infinite loops, kind of like our brains do when we try to figure out if this statement is false, is true or false. The more we think about the liar's paradox, the more we realize how complex and nuanced our understanding of truth and meaning really is. It challenges us to question some of our most basic assumptions and pushes us to develop more sophisticated ways of thinking about logic and language. You know how sometimes you're scrolling through Netflix for what feels like hours, trying to pick something to watch? Well, it turns out that overwhelming feeling of indecision isn't just annoying. It's actually part of a fascinating psychological phenomenon called the paradox of choice. This idea was popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz in his book, The Paradox of Choice: Why More is Less. And it challenges a lot of what we think we know about freedom and happiness. We tend to think that having more options is always better, right? Like if you're shopping for a new phone, you'd probably be excited to see a whole wall of different models to choose from. But Schwartz argues that all those choices might actually be making us miserable. It's not just about phones or Netflix either. This paradox shows up in all kinds of areas of our lives, from picking a career to deciding who to date. So, what's going on here? Well, one of the big factors is something called decision fatigue. Imagine you're standing in the cereal aisle at the grocery store trying to pick between 50 different kinds of breakfast cereal. Your brain has to work overtime to compare all those options, weighing the pros and cons of each one. By the time you finally make a choice, you're mentally exhausted, and you might not even be that happy with what you picked. This mental drain can lead to something researchers call choice paralysis. You know that feeling when you're so overwhelmed by options that you just can't decide? That's choice paralysis in action. Studies have shown that when people are faced with too many choices, they often end up delaying their decision or avoiding it altogether. So instead of picking a movie on Netflix, you might just give up and watch reruns of a show you've already seen a million times. But it's not just about feeling overwhelmed in the moment. The paradox of choice can have some pretty serious long-term effects on our happiness too. One of the big culprits here is regret. When we have tons of options to choose from, we're more likely to second-guess our decisions. You might pick a movie to watch, but the whole time you're wondering if one of the other options would have been better. This constant "what if" can really put a damper on our enjoyment of the things we do choose. Schwartz points out that the abundance of choice can also lead to unrealistic expectations. When we have so many options available, we start to think that the perfect choice must be out there somewhere. But here's the thing, perfection is pretty much impossible to achieve, so we end up disappointed with even really good choices because they don't live up to this imaginary ideal we've created in our heads. There's this famous study about jam that really drives home how the paradox of choice works in real life. Researchers set up a tasting booth in a grocery store. On some days, they offered 24 different flavors of jam, and on other days, they only offered 6. You'd think more flavors would lead to more sales, right? But it turns out the opposite happened. When there were fewer options, people were actually more likely to buy a jar of jam. The bigger selection just led to more deliberation and second-guessing. We see this play out in all kinds of situations. Think about trying to choose a career path these days. There are so many options out there, it can be totally overwhelming. You might spend years bouncing between different fields, never feeling quite satisfied because you're always wondering if there's a better fit out there somewhere. Or consider modern dating apps where you can swipe through hundreds of potential matches. It sounds great in theory, but a lot of people find that having so many options actually makes it harder to form meaningful connections. So what can we do about all this? Well, some experts suggest that we can mitigate the negative effects of choice overload by simplifying our decision-making processes. This might mean setting some limits for ourselves, like only considering 3 options instead of 20. Another strategy is to adopt what's called a satisficing mindset. Instead of trying to find the absolute perfect choice, we can learn to be content with options that are good enough. Practicing gratitude can also help counteract some of the negative effects of the paradox of choice. By focusing on appreciating what we have, rather than constantly wondering about what we're missing out on, we can boost our overall satisfaction with our decisions. You know how we've been talking about the ship of Theseus and all those philosophical questions about identity? Well, let's take that idea and apply it to something a bit closer to home, ourselves. We're not just talking about boats anymore, we're talking about you and me and everyone else. It turns out our bodies are constantly changing in ways that might make you question who you really are. Here's something wild to think about. Scientists estimate that our bodies replace around 50 to 70 billion cells every single day. That's billions with a B. It's like we're walking renovation projects constantly under construction. This isn't just a one-time thing either. Over the course of several years, most of the cells in our bodies get swapped out for new ones. Red blood cells stick around for about 4 months before they're replaced. Our skin cells only last a few weeks before they're shed and regenerated. Even our bones, which seem pretty permanent, are actually replaced roughly every decade. So here's the million-dollar question. If pretty much every part of your body has been replaced over time, are you still the same person you were years ago? It's not just a fun thought experiment either. This question has some serious implications for how we think about aging, personal responsibility, and even legal matters. Some philosophers argue that what really makes us us isn't our physical body at all. They say it's all about psychological continuity. Basically, our memories and experiences are what define us. According to this view, even if every cell in your body has been replaced, you're still you because you remember being you. It's kind of like how we might say someone is not themselves when they're acting out of character. We instinctively recognize that there's something beyond just the physical that makes a person who they are. But then there's the other side of the argument. Some people say that if all your cells have been replaced, you're literally not the same person anymore. This raises all sorts of weird questions. If you commit a crime and then over the years all your cells are replaced, should you still be held responsible? Are you the same person your parents raised? It gets pretty mind-bending when you start to really think about it. Interestingly, psychological studies have shown that most people tend to see their identity as a continuum. Even when we go through major changes in our appearance or health, we still feel like us. It's like our brains have this built-in sense of continuity that helps us maintain a stable sense of self, even as everything around us and inside us is changing. There's also this idea called narrative identity. It suggests that we construct our sense of self through the stories we tell about our lives. So as long as we can maintain a coherent life story, we feel like the same person even if our physical body has completely changed. It's kind of like how we can recognize a character in a TV show even if they change actors, as long as the core of who they are remains. Consistent, we accept them as the same person. The Ship of Theseus paradox. When applied to personal identity, really makes us think about how we relate to our past and future selves. Are you responsible for things you did in the past even though you're not technically the same person anymore? Should you care about your future self if they're going to be made up of completely different cells? It's enough to make your head spin. The more we ponder this paradox, the more we realize just how fluid and complex our identities really are. We're not static beings, we're constantly changing and evolving. Every experience we have, every memory we form, every cell that gets replaced is shaping who we are in subtle ways. It's like we're all ships sailing through time, constantly being rebuilt and repaired as we go. You know how we've been exploring all these mind-bending paradoxes? Well, get ready for one that's been messing with people's heads for over 2,000 years. Imagine a guy who claims he's the wisest person around because he knows he doesn't know anything. Sounds pretty weird, right? Well, this isn't just some random thought experiment. It's actually a core idea from one of the most influential thinkers in Western philosophy. We're talking about Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher who lived in Athens around 470–399 BCE. Now, Socrates wasn't your typical wise guy. He didn't go around preaching or writing books. Instead, he had this unique way of teaching called the Socratic method. It's like a verbal sparring match where you ask questions to stimulate critical thinking and expose the flaws in people's reasoning. But here's where things get really interesting. In Plato's account of Socrates in the Apology, Socrates claims that he's the wisest man in Athens. Why? Because he knows that he knows nothing. Now, if you're scratching your head thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, you're not alone. This is the heart of the paradox. Let's break it down. If Socrates knows that he knows nothing, then he actually knows something, right? And if he knows something, then his claim about knowing nothing can't be true. It's like a snake eating its own tail. It just keeps going round and round in circles. But here's the thing. This paradox isn't just some ancient brain teaser. It raises some pretty deep questions about the nature of knowledge and wisdom. What does it really mean to know something? How can we be sure of what we know? And is admitting our ignorance actually a form of wisdom? Some philosophers interpret Socrates' claim as a lesson in humility. It's like he's saying, hey, unlike all these other people who think they've got it all figured out, I at least know that I don't know everything. It's a reminder to question our assumptions and not get too cocky about what we think we know. Others see it as a challenge to the very idea of certain knowledge. After all, if one of the greatest minds in history is saying he doesn't know anything for sure, what hope do the rest of us have? It's enough to make you wonder if true certainty is even possible. This idea of questioning what we know isn't just ancient history. It's still super relevant today. In fact, there's a whole branch of philosophy called epistemology that deals with the nature and limits of knowledge. And let me tell you, these questions are just as tricky now as they were in Socrates' time. Think about it. How often do you feel absolutely 100% certain about something? And even when you do, how do you know that feeling of certainty isn't just an illusion? The more we think about what we know, the less certain we tend to become. It's like trying to grab a handful of water. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips away. But here's where it gets really wild. Some modern psychological studies have shown that people often overestimate their own knowledge and expertise. It's like we're hardwired to think we know more than we actually do. So, in a way, Socrates was way ahead of his time in recognizing this human tendency. This paradox isn't just some abstract philosophical concept. It has real-world implications. Think about how it applies to learning. If you approach a subject thinking you already know everything, you're not going to learn much. But if you come at it with the attitude that there's always more to discover, you're setting yourself up for growth. The same goes for decision-making. If you're too certain about your opinions, you might miss important information or perspectives. But if you're open to the possibility that you might be wrong, you're more likely to make better choices. And let's not forget about self-awareness. How well do you really know yourself? Our minds are incredibly complex, and there's a lot going on beneath the surface that we're not always aware of. Recognizing the limits of our self-knowledge can actually lead to greater understanding and personal growth. Have you ever wondered if there's a limit to how small things can get? This question has been puzzling philosophers and scientists for thousands of years, and it's about to take us on a wild ride through the history of science and philosophy. The ancient Greeks were the first to really dive into this idea, and they came up with a concept called atomism. These old-school thinkers, like Leucippus and Democritus, proposed that everything in the universe is made up of tiny, indivisible particles they called atoms. It's pretty mind-blowing to think that people were talking about atoms way back then, isn't it? But here's where things get really interesting. Modern physics has taken this idea of atomism and turned it on its head. We now know that atoms aren't actually the smallest building blocks of matter. They're made up of even tinier particles like protons, neutrons, and electrons. And when we start looking at these subatomic particles, things get really weird, really fast. Enter quantum mechanics, the branch of physics that deals with the behavior of matter and energy at the smallest scales. Quantum mechanics introduces this wild concept called quantization. Basically, it suggests that certain properties, like energy, don't exist in a smooth, continuous spectrum. Instead, they come in discrete amounts, kind of like steps on a staircase rather than a smooth ramp. This idea challenges the notion that we can keep dividing matter forever, because it implies there might be a fundamental limit to how finely we can slice things up. But wait, it gets even crazier. Some theories in modern physics propose that space itself might be discrete at the tiniest scales. There's this idea of a minimum length called the Planck length, which is so incredibly small that it's hard to even wrap our heads around it. At this scale, our usual understanding of space and time breaks down completely. It's like trying to measure the smoothness of a beach with a yardstick. At some point, you're going to hit the limit of what your tool can measure. This whole debate about whether matter is infinitely divisible or made up of discrete units is still raging in the world of physics today. It's not just some abstract concept either. It has real implications for how we understand the universe. If space and time are quantized, it raises all sorts of questions about the nature of continuity and how we measure things. Think about it this way. If you're zooming in on a digital photo, there comes a point where you start seeing individual pixels. You can't zoom in any further without losing information. Some physicists think reality might work in a similar way at the smallest scales. But instead of pixels, we're talking about fundamental units of space and time. The implications of these ideas are mind-bending. If space itself has a minimum size, what does that mean for our concept of distance? If time has a smallest unit, how does that affect our understanding of cause and effect? These questions challenge our intuitive grasp of reality in ways that can make your head spin. And here's the really wild part. The more we learn about the fundamental nature of matter and the universe, the more we realize how counterintuitive it all is. Our everyday experiences with objects in motion don't prepare us for the bizarre world of quantum mechanics. It's like we're trying to understand a 3D world while living on a 2D plane. This paradox of atomism touches on some of the deepest questions in physics and philosophy. It's not just about whether we can keep cutting things into smaller and smaller pieces. It's about the very nature of reality itself. Are the things we perceive as continuous actually made up of discrete units at some fundamental level? Or is there no end to how deeply we can probe into the fabric of the universe? As we explore these questions, we're constantly pushing the boundaries of our understanding. Every time we think we've found the smallest possible particle or the most fundamental law of physics, nature seems to have another surprise waiting for us. It's a humbling reminder of how much we still have to learn about the world around us. Have you ever looked up at the night sky and wondered why it's so dark? It seems like a simple question, but it's actually one of the most profound paradoxes in astronomy. This puzzle, known as Olbers' paradox, has been baffling scientists and stargazers for centuries. It's named after the German astronomer Heinrich Wilhelm Olbers, but he wasn't the first to ponder this cosmic conundrum. The paradox goes something like this. If the universe is infinite and filled with stars, then no matter where we look in the sky, our line of sight should eventually end on a star. Think about it like this. If you're in a forest, no matter which direction you look, you'll eventually see a tree trunk. So if the universe is an infinite forest of stars, Why isn't the night sky as bright as the surface of a star? This isn't just some trivial question for astronomy nerds. It actually has huge implications for how we understand the entire cosmos. If the universe really was infinite and static, with stars scattered uniformly throughout, then the night sky should be blindingly bright. But it's not. So what gives? The resolution to this paradox is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. It turns out that the universe isn't actually infinite and static like people used to think. Instead, it's expanding. This expansion means that light from really distant stars hasn't had enough time to reach us yet. It's like if you were in a forest, but new trees kept popping up faster than you could see them. But there's more to it than just expansion. The age of the universe plays a big role too. Our universe is about 13.8 billion years old, which might seem like a really long time, but it's not infinite. This means we can only see light from stars that have existed since the Big Bang. There's a limit to how far we can see, and that limit is determined by the age of the universe itself. This finite age puts a cap on the number of stars whose light can actually reach Earth. It's like being in a forest that only extends as far as you can see. Beyond that, there are no more trees. In the same way, beyond a certain distance, there are no more visible stars, simply because their light hasn't had time to reach us yet. Olbers's paradox has played a huge role in shaping our modern understanding of the cosmos. It's one of those questions that seems simple on the surface but leads to really deep insights when you start digging into it. It's helped us realize that the universe is dynamic, always changing and evolving, rather than being static and unchanging. When we look up at the night sky, we're not just seeing pretty lights. We're looking at a cosmic history book. The light from distant stars and galaxies has been traveling for millions or even billions of years to reach our eyes. So when we see a far-off galaxy, we're seeing it as it was in the distant past, not as it is now. This concept, mind-bending as it is, comes directly from our attempts to resolve Olber's paradox. The paradox also ties into other big ideas in cosmology. For example, it's related to the concept of the cosmic microwave background radiation. This is a faint glow that fills the entire universe, and it's actually the afterglow of the Big Bang itself. The existence of this radiation provides more evidence for the idea of an expanding universe with a finite age, which helps explain why the night sky is dark. Olber's paradox is a great example of how sometimes the simplest questions can lead to the most profound insights. It challenges our intuitions about infinity and visibility in an ever-expanding cosmos. It reminds us that the universe is way more complex and mysterious than we might think at first glance. From the depths of space, we dive into the microscopic world of the ocean. Imagine a bustling underwater city where thousands of different species coexist, despite limited resources. How is this possible? This puzzling abundance challenges everything we thought we knew about biodiversity, and it's known as the paradox of the plankton. Evelyn Hutchinson first proposed this paradox back in 1961, and it's been giving scientists headaches ever since. Here's the thing. According to the competitive exclusion principle, two species fighting for the same resources shouldn't be able to coexist indefinitely. One should eventually outcompete the other. But when we look at plankton communities, we see the exact opposite. There's an incredible diversity of species all living together in the same environment. This paradox isn't just about tiny floating organisms. It's a challenge to our fundamental understanding of competition and biodiversity. It's like finding a jungle in the middle of a desert. It just shouldn't work according to what we thought we knew about ecosystems. So what's going on here? Well, scientists have come up with a few theories to explain this unexpected diversity. One idea is that the environment might be more variable than we initially thought. This variability could allow for what's called niche differentiation. Basically, different species of plankton might be adapting to slightly different aspects of their environment, allowing them to coexist without directly competing for the exact same resources. But that's not the only possibility. Other researchers have suggested that factors like predation and symbiosis might play a significant role in maintaining this diversity. It's like a complex underwater soap opera, with different species interacting in ways we're only beginning to understand. Predators might keep any one species from becoming too dominant, while symbiotic relationships could help multiple species thrive together. The more we study these ecosystems, the more complex and interconnected they appear. It's not just about competition anymore. It's about a whole network of relationships and interactions that we're only starting to unravel. This complexity is challenging our traditional views of ecology and forcing us to think about ecosystems in new ways. While the paradox of the plankton hasn't been fully resolved, it's led to some fascinating developments in ecological research. Scientists are now diving deeper into ecosystem dynamics, looking at how different factors interact to create and maintain biodiversity. It's like we've opened a door to a whole new world of ecological understanding. One of the most interesting implications of Hutchinson's work is the idea that this paradox might not be limited to plankton. The principles we're discovering here could apply to other ecosystems as well. It's possible that the mechanisms allowing for high plankton diversity are also at work in forests, grasslands, and even urban environments. This paradox has also got scientists thinking about ecological resilience. If diverse communities can thrive in seemingly limited environments, what does that mean for how ecosystems respond to change? Could a more diverse ecosystem be better equipped to handle environmental shifts? These are questions that could have major implications for conservation efforts and our understanding of how ecosystems might respond to climate change. As we continue to study the paradox of the plankton, we're learning that biodiversity isn't just about competition. It's about a whole range of ecological interactions that work together to create thriving, diverse communities. This shift in perspective is changing how we approach ecology and conservation. Just as the ocean's diversity thrives through unexpected relationships, our society grapples with its own paradoxical balance. Imagine a world where being completely tolerant could lead to the death of tolerance itself. This isn't science fiction. It's a real philosophical dilemma that's shaping our laws and social norms right now. The paradox of tolerance, introduced by philosopher Karl Popper in his work The Open Society and Its Enemies, challenges us to question whether there's a point where being too open-minded might actually close our minds for good. Popper's argument is pretty wild when you think about it. He's basically saying that if a society is tolerant without any limits, it could end up destroying itself. How? Well, imagine if we let intolerant groups do whatever they want. They might start imposing their views on others, and before you know it, the whole tolerant society could collapse. It's like letting a bully run wild in a playground. Eventually, no one else gets to play. This paradox isn't just some abstract idea that philosophers debate over coffee. It's got real-world implications that affect our everyday lives. Think about free speech, for example. How far should it go? Should we let people say absolutely anything, even if it's hateful or dangerous? Or should there be limits? These are the kinds of questions that lawmakers and judges wrestle with all the time. In practice, different societies have tried to tackle this paradox in various ways. Many democratic countries have laws against hate speech. They argue that these laws are necessary to protect everyone's rights and safety. It's like saying, you can say what you want, but you can't threaten or harm others with your words. But of course, this approach has its critics too. Some people worry that any limit on free speech is a slippery slope. They think it could lead to a situation where the government gets to decide what we can and can't say, which sounds pretty scary. It's a valid concern. After all, history has shown us plenty of examples where censorship has been used to control people and suppress opposition. The tension between maintaining a tolerant society and protecting it from intolerant ideologies isn't just a modern problem. We can see it play out in historical events too. Take the rise of fascism in Europe, for example. Initially, tolerant societies failed to confront intolerant ideologies until it was too late. It's a chilling reminder of what can happen when we don't find the right balance. From a philosophical perspective, the paradox of tolerance really makes us think hard about the balance between freedom and responsibility. It's not just about what we can do, but what we should do. How do we handle beliefs that could lead to harm if they're allowed to spread unchecked? It's a tricky ethical question without any easy answers. In the United States, discussions about the paradox of tolerance often center around the First Amendment. This constitutional protection of free speech is a cornerstone of American democracy. But even here, there are limits. Speech that incites violence or poses a direct threat to public safety isn't protected. It's like the old saying about not being allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire. As we think about this paradox, it's important to remember that it's not just a theoretical exercise. It has real consequences for how we live together in diverse societies. How do we create a world where different viewpoints can coexist without allowing harmful ideologies to take over? It's a balancing act that requires constant vigilance and thoughtful consideration. The paradox of tolerance invites us to keep reflecting on these complex issues. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but by grappling with these questions, we can work towards creating societies that are both open and resilient. It's about finding ways to protect the values we hold dear while still remaining open to new ideas and perspectives. After diving deep into these mind-bending paradoxes, you might be feeling mentally exhausted. But before you drift off, let's explore one final contradiction: how thinking about these puzzles could actually be your ticket to dreamland. It's a paradox about paradoxes, and it might just change the way you approach bedtime. You'd think that all this mental gymnastics would keep your mind racing, but sleep researchers have stumbled upon a counterintuitive discovery. It turns out that engaging in complex cognitive activities like pondering paradoxes might actually enhance your ability to fall asleep. This is because when our brains tackle deep thinking tasks, they can experience a kind of mental fatigue that primes us for rest. Think about it like this. After a long day of physical exercise, your body craves rest and relaxation. Well, it seems our brains might work in a similar way. When we push our cognitive limits by grappling with intricate logical puzzles, our minds can reach a point where they're ready to wind down and recharge. But it's not just about tiring out your brain. There's something uniquely soothing about embracing the uncertainty and contradiction that paradoxes present. Some people find that accepting complexity can actually ease their minds into a state that's more conducive to sleep. It's like giving your brain permission to let go of the need for clear-cut answers and embrace the ambiguity of the in-between. This process of contemplating paradoxes can act as a form of cognitive wind-down. As you navigate through these intricate logical puzzles, your mind might naturally start to drift into that hazy pre-sleep state. It's almost like the paradoxes themselves become a kind of mental lullaby, gently rocking your thoughts towards slumber. Now, you might be wondering how this actually works in practice. Well, let's say you're lying in bed, and instead of worrying about tomorrow's to-do list, you start thinking about the ship of Theseus. As you ponder whether an object that has had all its parts replaced is still the same object, you're engaging in a form of mental exercise that's both stimulating and potentially relaxing. Or maybe you find yourself mulling over Zeno's paradox, imagining Achilles forever chasing that tortoise. The infinite nature of this paradox might actually help your mind drift off into the infinite realm of sleep. It's like counting sheep, but with a philosophical twist that keeps your brain engaged just enough to distract it from more stressful thoughts. Of course, everyone's different, and what works for one person might not work for another. Some folks might find that thinking about paradoxes gets them too worked up and actually makes it harder to sleep. But for others, it could be the perfect recipe for drifting off into a peaceful slumber. There's also something to be said for the sense of mental expansion that comes from grappling with these complex ideas. As you lie there in the dark, contemplating the nature of reality or the limits of human knowledge, you might find that your mind feels more open and relaxed. It's like you've given your brain a good stretch, and now it's ready to settle in for the night. And let's not forget the element of distraction. Often, what keeps us awake at night are anxious thoughts or worries about everyday life. By focusing on abstract paradoxes instead, you're giving your mind something else to chew on. It's a form of mental redirection that could help you break free from those cycles of stress and overthinking that often plague us at bedtime. So the next time you're having trouble falling asleep, why not give paradox pondering a try? Instead of scrolling through your phone or tossing and turning, pick a paradox and let your mind wander through its twists and turns. You might just find that the very complexity that seemed so stimulating earlier now serves as a soothing path to sleep. As we reach the end of our journey through these mind-bending paradoxes, it's clear that engaging with these complex ideas can have some surprising benefits. Studies suggest that grappling with paradoxes might actually enhance our cognitive flexibility and creativity. By challenging our assumptions and pushing the boundaries of our understanding, we open ourselves up to new perspectives and innovative ways of thinking. This process of wrestling with contradictions and seemingly impossible scenarios isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a way to expand our mental horizons and approach problems from fresh angles. As you drift off to sleep, let these paradoxes inspire a sense of wonder about the intricate world we inhabit. The next time you encounter a challenging situation or a complex problem, you might find that your mind is more prepared to tackle it in unexpected ways. Sweet dreams, and may your thoughts be filled with the endless possibilities that paradoxes reveal to us.